Chapter 690. The news of the sword principal realm appearing in the Jade Spring Sea quickly spread in the nearby sea. Apart from the players who were not afraid of death, it also attracted the attention of some sea swordsmen. With the intention to test the waters, these sea swordsmen came from all directions. However, they only had one life, so they were not as wild as the players. They observed for a long time outside the sword principal realm before stepping into it tentatively. Like Ao Jian, they did not directly become the target of the sword seals in the realm because they possessed sword will. Instead, they were challenged by the sword wills of different sword seals. In the battle of sword wills, the loser's sword will would inevitably fade, causing the sword heart to be unstable. Many swordsmen did not dare to take this step, but it was not up to them because they would face the attack of the sword seals if they did not accept it. In such an environment, many swordsmen had their sword will suppressed and even lost their lives in this sword principal realm. However, there were also some swordsmen who regarded this place as a treasure and began the path of growth of their sword wills. What was different from Ao Jian was that since they had chosen to become the sword vermin in the field of swordsmanship, they could only win and not lose. Because the price of failure was the shattering of the sword heart. The sword wills would be swallowed by the sword seals left by the sword master in the realm and become their nutrients. For these swordsmen, although life was precious, such a rare opportunity for growth could not be exchanged with their lives. Therefore, they set foot on this path resolutely. During this period, many famous swordsmen in the nearby sea had their sword hearts shattered under the attack of the sword seals in the realm and died here. At this moment, the sword principal realm had become their trial ground of life and death. During this period, swordsmanship had also become a popular choice for the players. They all wanted to learn to comprehend sword wills and condense their own sword hearts. With the special effect of immortality, the players launched an attack on this realm. No matter what sword seals they were, as long as they dared to come over, they would be the first to challenge it. However, without exception, the sword seals in the realm would not care about the player's provocation and would kill them on the spot. Except for a few sword seals that were severely broken and captured by the players because they did not have any residual consciousness. Most of the sword seals were only hostile to the players. This made the players depressed and caused a lot of negative emotions to grow. However, it was impossible for them to give up just like that. The forum content these few days was discussing how to comprehend sword wills in the sword principal realm. The players were waiting for the expert players to give them a guide as soon as possible so that they could take a shortcut. The professional players didn't disappoint the players. Soon, someone sorted out the method to comprehend the sword intent. One of the posts ignited the passion of the players and gave them hope of understanding the sword will. Sword intent cultivation method. Basic sword technique cultivation technique. Owner. Moot Juga content. Since everyone has sent me private messages so enthusiastically, hoping that I can explain the content in this aspect, I will explain my understanding of sword essence in detail. Before that, let me first talk about what happened to me before I comprehended sword intent. In fact, I didn't understand sword intent at all in the beginning. Although I was a swordsmanship teacher in reality, I thought that my swordsmanship was very powerful until I met Ao Jian. This guy was really too ruthless. A level 1 newbie who had just entered the game dared to challenge my main account. At that time, I didn't take him seriously at all, but in the end, I was slapped in the face, Chio bawling out. JPG. Only then did I realize that swords could be used in such a way. Unwilling to admit defeat, I began to study swordsmanship, wanting to surpass him. But it turned out that I didn't have that ability at all. So, my mentality changed from surpassing Ao Jian to studying Ao Jian's swordsmanship. During that time, I opened Ao Jian's video dozens of times a day to observe his swordsmanship during the battle. But the result disappointed me. Just by observing, I only improved my swordsmanship slightly, but I couldn't do it as smoothly as Ao Jian did. During that time, I planned to give up using swords and change my class to Rune Master, capital. Wretched, JPG. But in the end, I plucked up my courage and chose to private message Ao Jian to ask him for advice on swordsmanship. That period lasted for about 2 months. Every day, I would private message Aogn and ask him questions sincerely. But everyone knew that Aogn was cold and aloof, so he didn't reply to my messages at all. But I didn't give up. I persisted for 2 months and asked him privately every day. Maybe my sincerity moved Aogn. 2 months later, he blocked me. Flips table. JPG. The turning point came. Just when I thought that my swordsmanship talent couldn't be saved, I met a one-armed old man in the Kolong Ocean. This guy taught me what sword intent was. At that time, I knew that sword intent wasn't an inherent move or swordsmanship technique, but something intrinsic. Doesn't it sound very mysterious? I thought so too at that time. But it wasn't until I understood the ruler-shattering sword intent that I realized how amazing this thing was. To be more precise, sword intent was the condensation of your essence, chi, and spirit, condensing a heart sword in your heart that was completely consistent with your thoughts. This was also the origin of sword intent, also known as the heart of the sword. For example, if you were a very wretched person, then you would never be able to condense the sword intent of advancing with indomitable will. I'm not targeting anyone. I'm just making an analogy. The heart of the sword is more like a microcosm of a person's character, which affects the sword intent you understand. That was how I understood it under the guidance of the one-armed old man. The appearance of this post made the players understand what sword intent was for the first time. Although many players were still confused and couldn't understand what was going on, they had no idea what was going on. However, some players understood something from it. Sword intent, the microcosm of a person's character and emotions, condensing one's heart of the sword with the sword as the carrier, and then giving birth to sword intent at this moment. A large number of players began to try. Starting from understanding the sword, they deepened their understanding step by step. Then, they tried to attach their emotions to the sword. At a deeper level, they imagined the specific appearance of the sword in their minds and condensed the heart of the sword within their bodies. Subsequently, the players also found some information about sword intent cultivation from the library and gradually perfected the method of sword intent cultivation. Since the appearance of that post, the entire land of Baiki was filled with figures who were holding swords and comprehending sword intent. At this moment, the difference in talent was also revealed. Some extremely talented players condensed their own heart of the sword in just a few days. Although they were still young, they were considered to have taken the first step on the path of swordsmanship cultivation. The first major faction of the self-created profession was slowly born in this kind of exploration. The Kendo domain became the trial ground for these players who had comprehended the first step of the heart of the sword. The iron-headed players only had the heart of the sword, but they dared to step into the domain and challenge the sword seal left by the sword master before they could figure out sword intent. As a result, the sword seal in the Kendo domain ushered in a wave of scamming by the players. After these players stepped into the domain, the sword seal would sense it and automatically find these players, initiating a sword intent challenge. Although these players accepted the challenge, they could not even fart for a long time. After all, they had not comprehended sword intent, so they could not fight with sword intent. From that moment on, all the sword seals in the domain had completely become the whetstone for the players to condense their own sword intent. Although the outcome of doing so was miserable, many players also had their own ideas about the shape of their own sword while during the attempt. Relying on this Kendo domain, the strength of the players quietly underwent a transformation. A month had passed, and the attacks in the Kendo domain were still ongoing. In addition to the players, there were more and more swordsmen who came after hearing the news. They volunteered to become sword vermin and were prepared to either achieve great success in Kendo or perish here. During this period of confrontation with the sword seals, many swordsmen cultivated into the devil and became the sword demons in this domain. They had completely lost their minds, and only killing was left in their minds. It could be said that they were completely controlled by sword intent. During this month, Ao Jin did not stop his comprehension of Kendo. Relying on the inextinguishable heart of the sword, he had always failed, but he was never frustrated. Instead, he enjoyed the gradual growth of sword intent. This time, Ao Jian was walking on the path of all-encompassing, trying to comprehend the thousands of sword intent left by the underworld sword lord. His sword intent became stronger in such challenges and growth, and he was gradually able to defeat some of the broken sword seals. Although his level and equipment did not change, Ao Jian's strength was getting stronger day by day. On this day, an uninvited guest came to the south of the Jade Sea. This person carried a 3-meter-long sword on his back. He had a shaved head and wore a one-eyed mask. A faint sword Dao Divine Seal was flowing on his forehead. He was a godly state expert. After entering the Jade Sea, this person went straight to the Kendo domain. After a few flashes, he appeared in the Kendo domain that was shrouded in hazy mist. Looking down from above, Sui Ye's face was filled with ecstasy. This was because he felt the rich aura of sword intent below. He was also very familiar with this aura. It was the sword intent comprehended by his master, the sword lord who led him on the path of Kendo cultivation. This was also the reason why he came here. In fact, he had sensed at the moment the sword lord died. However, he had no idea where the sword lord went after he died. He had been looking for it all this time, and now he had found it. Thinking of this, he entered the Kendo domain in a flash. Although the sword lord was dead, his inheritance was left behind. This place contained the powerful sword intent that he wanted, as well as the power of the sword principle that he longed for. If he could obtain it, his future path of Kendo cultivation would be smooth sailing. He could completely follow the sword lord's path and cultivate to the ancient god realm. He could not resist such a temptation. The divine seal between Sui Ye's brows flashed the moment he entered the Kendo domain. Countless sword intent divine seals in the domain immediately sensed this Kendo aura and swarmed toward him, challenging him. Seeing this, Sui Ye suddenly pulled out the giant sword on his back and pointed it forward. A violent sword aura descended. The surrounding sword seal fragments were unable to withstand this domineering sword intent at all, and they all shattered into pieces. After shattering all the surrounding sword seals, the divine seal on Sui Ye's forehead flashed and absorbed all the shattered sword intent into the divine seal. Feeling the sword lord's power of Kendo, Sui Ye smiled. He knew that his time to rise had come. At this moment, he would turn into a sword insect and compete with all the sword seals and swordsmen in the domain. The final winner would be the new underworld sword lord. Chapter 691. As time passed, the brutal attacks in the Sword Tao domain became more and more frenzied. The closer one got to the center of the Sword Tao domain, the more complete the sword seal was and the stronger the sword will was. Along the way, many swordsmen died. There were also swordsmen who completely turned into sword demons and were imprisoned by the sword intent, becoming sword slaves within the domain. In fact, the swordsmen who had entered the domain all knew that this was a path to becoming an expert. They also knew that it was dangerous. However, at this point, no swordsmen were willing to give up. In other words, they could no longer give up. The contest of sword essences between the swordsmen also unfolded as they advanced. At this moment, their enemies were not only the sword seals left behind by the underworld swordsman, but also his companions. Because no matter if it was a swordsman or a sword seal, there could only be one winner. Even though some of the swordsmen who had already received the underworld sword venerable's inheritance felt that they had gained enough, it was too late for them to leave. Accepting the inheritance was equivalent to accepting the rules of the sword intent struggle. Even if he had the intention to retreat and didn't take action, he would still be punished by the sword Tao laws. His sword heart would inevitably shatter. It was like a boat sailing against the current. If one did not advance, they would be pushed back. In this cruel netherworld, for swordsmen, losing their sword heart was equivalent to losing their most important martial power. No one was willing to live an ordinary life. Losing their martial power was even more difficult to accept than death. Thus, they could only grit their teeth and move forward. At this moment, Sui Ye was sitting on the west side of the sword principal domain, digesting a powerful sword seal that he had absorbed recently. A moment later, Sui Ye let out a breath and opened his eyes. In an instant, the giant sword on his back trembled, and a brand new sword was born in the heart of the sword. Feeling the sword intent, Sui could not help but laugh out loud. This sword was called Overlapping Waves, and it was one of Venerable Sword's strongest moves before he stepped into the Yellow Springs Central Sea region to fight for supremacy. Back then, Sui had also asked Venerable Sword to learn from him, but Venerable Sword did not teach him. Therefore, Sui was delighted that he could comprehend it in such an easy way. Suddenly, Sui's eyes narrowed as he sensed an aura approaching him. He immediately turned around and looked behind him. Not far away, a figure was rowing a small boat through the thick fog, slowly heading towards him. Sui said nothing and waited quietly. At this moment, the boat approached him. Then, a man put down the oar in his hand and pointed at him expressionlessly. "Brother, sword intent challenge." Sui sneered when he heard that. How naive. Along the way, he'd encountered many swordsmen who'd challenged him to a sword intent challenge, but without exception, all of them had become nourishment for his sword seal and were truly unable to withstand a single blow. However, Sui still nodded and accepted his challenge, and he didn't kill him right away. He planned to abide by the rules of this domain and avoid touching any unnecessary taboos. At the thought of this, a powerful sword essence emerged from Sui's body, and he waited for the swordsman before him to accept the challenge. The player was delighted to see Sui accepting the challenge. Then, he clenched his fists with a grim expression. A moment later, Sui looked at the players whose faces were red from holding back their anger and asked in surprise, "Where's your sword intent?" "Shut up. I'm almost out." The player scolded impatiently. Then, he continued to hold his breath. Sui was dumbfounded when he saw the player's muscles trembling as if he was overexerting himself. This was the first time he had seen such a strange way of condensing sword intent. For a swordsman, it was the most basic ability to control the sword intent as if it was their own arm. With just a thought, they could gather and control the sword intent to kill their opponents. Sui was speechless as he looked at the guy who was trying to cooperate with his body. A moment later, Sui's gaze changed. This was because the challenger before him was still condensing his sword intent after so long, and he hadn't done it even after so long. He suspected that he had been fooled. He was one of the 8 sword envoys of the Netherworld Merchant Guild, and he was highly respected. Yet, he was wasting time here with a newbie who hadn't even condensed his sword intent. It was truly embarrassing. "I'll give you 5 seconds. If you can't condense your sword intent, I'll kill you. 5 more minutes. Soon, it's almost out." Sui heard that, and the sword intent in his body suddenly locked onto the player before him. He suddenly slashed out a violent sword aura, and it split the seawater in front of him into 2. It took a long time for the wound to heal, and the player was instantly killed by suffocation. After killing this person, Sui didn't even want to look at him anymore. He turned around and left with a livid expression. "I actually wasted so much time with this idiot." Sui didn't feel good when he thought of this. However, Sui had only taken a few steps when he suddenly felt an extremely powerful force descending on him. Even he couldn't resist this force. Sword Dao Rule. Sui was very familiar with this force, because he had also grasped the power of the Sword Dao Rule. However, compared to the Sword Venerable, his mastery of the Sword Dao Rule was merely superficial. It was incomparable. The force instantly invaded Sui's Sword Dao Divine Seal, and it forcefully extracted a sword intent from it. However, Sui could only watch helplessly. He was powerless to resist it. After the force dispersed, Sui felt lingering fear. He immediately checked if his Sword Dao Divine Seal was damaged. Sui was dumbfounded as he checked. The sword intent extracted by the power of the Sword Dao Rule was the Overlapping Waves sword intent that he had just obtained. "Ah!" Sui roared furiously, and he raised a huge wave with his fist. As expected, breaking the rules would violate the taboo of the territory. He had speculated about this before, but Sui didn't expect the punishment to be this severe. He felt like he was screwed over by that idiot just now. An insignificant challenge had cost him a sword intent that he desired. Rage surged in his heart, but that person was already dead. Sui had nowhere to vent his anger. After taking a deep breath to calm himself down, Suiye flashed and went deeper into the territory. Although the overlapping wave sword intent was extremely precious, Suiye chose to let go of his rage when he thought about the many more powerful sword intents inside the territory. He continued to explore until he obtained the Sword Venerable's complete inheritance. Around 4 hours later, Suiye encountered another familiar sword intent. Mystical Demon Sword Intent. The sword intent was named after a powerful enemy that the Sword Venerable had once lost to. The sword intent contained the resentment of the mystical demons, and it was extremely powerful. Suiye didn't hesitate and immediately clashed with the sword intent. Although the sword intent was extremely powerful, it was still a fragment of a divine seal. It was no match for his complete Sword Dao divine seal and was absorbed in the end. After absorbing it completely, Suiye smiled again. The negative emotions caused by the loss of the overlapping wave sword intent had mostly dispersed. "Brother, it's fate that we met here. Let's prove it." A figure appeared not far away out of nowhere and looked at him with a joyful expression. Suiye turned around coldly and resisted the urge to kill him on the spot. He said in a deep voice, "You want to challenge me?" The player nodded matter-of-factly. "Do you dare to fight me?" Suiye's rage hadn't subsided yet. Since he was challenged, he didn't say anything else. He immediately gathered his sword intent and locked onto the player. "Wait." The player nodded with a serious expression. Then, a familiar scene appeared in Suiye's mind. The player clenched his fists, tensed his muscles, and began to exert force at this moment. Suiye's body trembled. He even had the urge to kill. Which crooked swordsman taught these disciples? Who the hell told you to gather sword intent like this? Suiye was about to explode. It was the first time he had encountered such a strange situation in his life. He felt like he was constipated when he tried to gather sword intent. No, it was the second time. "Brother, don't worry. I'm coming out soon." Suiye. Percent at hashtag yin% at. Suiye took a deep breath and tried to calm himself down. If he violated the taboo again, he would lose the sword intent he obtained. He had to stay calm this time. With that in mind, Suiye restrained himself and waited for the person in front of him to gather his sword intent. Time passed bit by bit. 2 hours later, Suiye's expression was numb. That idiot was still exerting force. It was tiring to watch. At this moment, the players suddenly shouted excitedly, "It's here. Come, accept the challenge." Suiye's expression turned solemn when he heard that. He felt inexplicably happy. This happiness even made him feel a little humble. But it was finally going to end. As Suiye looked at him expectantly, the player suddenly shouted angrily, took out his long sword, and pointed it at him. Puff! Along with the sound, the tip of the long sword in the player's hand emitted a green smoke, but it dissipated before it could take shape. Seeing this, the player sheathed his sword awkwardly and said, "Brother, I'm sorry. Please wait a little longer. We'll start again." "Go to hell." At this moment, Suiye couldn't hold it in anymore. F*CK, the taboo. F*CK, the sword intent. I'll kill. The raging sword intent instantly tore the player into pieces, while Suiye vented his anger at the sea in front of him, splitting the seawater into countless pieces. At this moment, the familiar power of the Sword Dao, law, descended upon him again. Suiye, who was powerless to resist, only had one thought in his mind. When I get out, I must find the sword master who taught them sword techniques. I must let that sword master who misled the students know the meaning of cruelty and despair. What the hell did he teach? Chapter 692. The competition for supremacy in the Sword Dao domain was a cruel rule of advancement. Sword seals and swordsmen would fight to the death in the Sword Dao domain, and the final winner would be able to combine thousands of sword wills, condense their own sword heart, and forge a supreme Sword Dao mark. Although the process was cruel, the person who obtained the final result would definitely forge a new legend. Therefore, many swordsmen stepped into the domain despite knowing that it was dangerous inside. It was an opportunity that they could not even exchange with their lives, and missing it would be the same for the rest of their lives. This also caused the cruelty inside to escalate. However, with the participation of the players, the situation changed in a strange way. Although the players were also very serious, they only wanted to hone their sword wills inside. With the thought that everyone could obtain the inheritance and everyone could be a proud sword, the players stepped into the Sword Dao domain excitedly. Countless swordsmen and sword seals inside were challenged by the players. The players also wanted a share of the Sword Principle Battle Royale. Some of the players did activate their sword wills during the challenge. Although the sword wills were weak, it at least proved that the plan was feasible. This also caused more players to enter. After all, it was an inheritance, which was very precious in the eyes of the players. Even if it was incomplete, the players still desired it. However, it was also because of the participation of the players that a powerhouse who was determined to obtain the inheritance of the underworld sword Venerable exploded. What made Se even more desperate was that every time he obtained a precious Sword Dao inheritance, there would always be a swordsman who would jump out and challenge him. Why didn't he know his own strength? Where did he get the courage to challenge me? Sueya was exhausted and did not want to talk. He tried a few times to wait patiently for the opponent to condense sword wills, thinking that it would be over as long as he held it in. The truth was, he could not bear it all. There was once when he waited for a whole day, a whole 24 hours, but the player did not even fart in the end. Moreover, his sword heart pursued following one's heart, which was completely different from North Star One Blade and Proud Sword Heart. With such a sword heart, the sword would follow the heart, and enduring it over and over again would only mess up the sword heart. It could be said that the existence of the Sword Dao domain and the players completely countered Siya at the moment. Sui could not bear the insult of his intelligence for too long. In the end, he could only follow his heart and attack. However, if he attacked, he would be punished by the law of the sword in the domain, and the rare sword that he worked so hard to obtain would be taken away. It could be said that they had completely fallen into an endless loop. After encountering a couple of players, Suiya's mind exploded, and he had a guess. These swordsmen condensed their sword wills in exactly the same way. Did that mean that they all came from the same lineage? So, who was the mentor behind these retarded swordsmen? How could he teach such strange disciples? Who gave him the courage to teach disciples? Sui couldn't figure it out, nor could he figure out the reason behind it. His mind was assaulted again and again. Of course, the players didn't know that. They thought they were practicing the orthodox way of condensing sword will. Ever since Mood Yoga posted the strategy of condensing sword intent in the forum, the experts on the forum began to compile the existing information and published a detailed guide to condensing sword intent. The players relied on these guides to become self-taught. It could be said that these strategies were carved from the same mold. Although every player had a different understanding of the strategy, their understanding of the step of condensing sword intent was surprisingly consistent. Back then, Mood Yoga's post mentioned that condensing sword intent required the concentration of spirit, chi, and spirit. That was the most difficult part of stopping the players from improving. Living in the age of chaos, the players had no idea how to concentrate spirit, chi, and spirit. Therefore, most players interpreted it as limitless concentration. That was how the method of holding one's breath and concentrating came about. Many players thought that such a ridiculous strategy was the truth. After a few players learned sword intent through this method by accident, the method went out of control. That was the key reason why the players that Sui encountered would try so hard to condense their sword wills. It could be said that this was the method of condensing sword intent that the players created themselves, and it was the only one in the netherworld. Although the method was terrible, it did have some effect on concentrating spirit, chi, and spirit. But recently, the players found a new method of condensing sword intent, and most of the players who tried it succeeded. After the method was posted on the forum by a player, it quickly became popular. I tried the method that the guy gave me yesterday, and it really worked. Everyone, let's try in the Kendo domain. Content. Yesterday, a guy posted that there was a bald swordsman in the Sword Dao domain who would passionately teach players how to condense sword intent. Back then, he was ridiculed by others. Now, I've met him. With the mentality of giving it a try, I challenged him. But when I was about to condense sword intent, he persuaded me to give up. He then carefully taught me how to condense sword intent. His explanation was super detailed, and it was very useful. I quickly condensed sword intent according to his method. Therefore, the guy from yesterday wasn't bragging. Everyone, let's try it. Now, I suspect that this bald mentor is a hidden character that the stupid officials hid in the Kendo domain. Just like the mysterious merchant, you'll be lucky if you meet him. As long as you challenge him, the Hidden Quest Sword Intent Comprehension Guide will be activated. Finally, I attached a picture of the person. His features are obvious. He's carrying a great sword, has a muscular body, and is bald. Attached picture. JPG. Finally, I attached the sword intent that I condensed. Green and blue sword intent, basic sword intent. Sword intent details, basic sword intent method. The color represents the inclination of emotions. The lethality is weak. The appearance of this post immediately attracted the attention of the players. Especially at the end of the post, there was a sword intent comprehended by the original poster, which was highly credible. Soon, such a piece of news spread in the forum. A bald man carrying a greatsword was a hidden NPC of the stupid officials. As long as you meet him in the Kendo domain and challenge him, he will carefully teach you how to condense your own sword intent. Finally, there was a small Easter egg. After you condense sword intent, the bald man will suddenly turn hostile and kill you. At least in the eyes of the players, this was undoubtedly an Easter egg. As soon as the news came out, a large number of players followed suit. They all wanted to find the hidden bald man in the Kendo domain, trigger the hidden teaching from the stupid officials, and receive swordsmanship guidance. When Lu Wu, who was behind the scenes, heard the news, he couldn't stop smiling. Sure enough, the players were all geniuses. What a F** king hidden character. The sword god of the central sea of the netherworld was now reduced to a swordsmanship instructor. Lu Wu's scalp went numb at the players' antics. To this, he only wanted to say, keep up the good work. Let the sword god of the netherworld merchant guild nurture a sword cultivator with potential. How wonderful. South of the Jade Sea, the Kendo domain had been around for a month and a half, but still hadn't disappeared. Instead, swordsmen and players kept pouring in to join the killing feast. At the same time, at the west of the Kendo domain, Suya was instructing a player on how to condense his own sword intent. Looking at the dumbfounded player, Suya resisted the urge to smash his head with his sword. This was because he had just obtained a powerful sword intent left behind by the underworld sword lord, and he didn't want to lose it just like that. However, he couldn't refuse the player's challenge. Therefore, in order to get rid of these repulsive people as soon as possible, he could only patiently teach them. He hoped that they could comprehend sword intent as soon as possible so that he could kill them with one strike. Sui's heart was filled with despair. He was one of the 8 sword envoys of the Netherworld Merchant Guild. Countless swordsmen came to him with treasures to ask for swords, but he didn't care about them at all. However, he was now reduced to a lowly swordsmanship instructor, and the people he taught were idiots who knew nothing. What was even more unbelievable was that these swordsmen didn't know a single thing about swordsmanship. It could be said that they had no foundation at all. This undoubtedly made Sui's desire to kill the swordsmen who misled the students even stronger. Why can't you teach your disciples well and make me suffer? I really want to kill your whole family. After the explanation, Suya looked up at the player and said, "Do you understand?" The player blinked and scratched his head in embarrassment. "Can you explain it again? I don't really understand." Veins popped on Suya's forehead when he heard that. He couldn't help but tremble, and raging flames of anger exploded in his chest. "Pig, you're even more stupid than the previous idiot. How dare you practice swordsmanship like this? Where did you get the courage?" Of course, he didn't say that out loud, afraid that it would hurt the person's confidence and make it harder for him to condense sword intent. If that happened, he would waste a lot of time again. Sighing, Suya looked up at the hazy night sky, feeling extremely aggrieved. In order to inherit the sword intent of Sword Venerable of Yellow Springs, he didn't get stuck in the battle with the sword seal, but was stuck in the hands of the swordsmen in the nearby sea region. This pain, it was so F** king painful. Taking a deep breath, Suya looked down at the player with the broken sword and said, "Listen carefully. Listen carefully. I'm going to say it again in detail." "Okay, go ahead." After an hour and a half of detailed explanation and personal practice, as Suya's eyes brimmed with tears, the player finally condensed his basic sword intent. "I'm so happy." The happiness made Suya feel humble, but he couldn't help but feel excited. In return, Suya crushed the player's sword intent with his sword intent without hesitation, then raised his greatsword and killed him on the spot. "I'm free." After a moment of excitement, Suya looked up at the sky, and his gaze became determined again. "No matter how difficult it is, I will obtain all of Master's sword intent. I will be the next sword venerable of Yellow Springs." At that moment, several exclamations came from afar. "That brother didn't lie to us. The coordinates are reliable. Look at that Baldy and greatsword. He's the hidden swordsmanship instructor. We've hit the jackpot. Don't let him get away. Hurry up and issue the challenge." "Hey, that Baldy, do you dare to fight against my sword intent?" Suya's smile froze on his face when he heard the voices not far away. Realizing that the situation wasn't good, he immediately wanted to leave. However, the sword intent challenge was formed, and the aura of the rule of sword quietly descended. Although the players couldn't sense it, Suya did. He forced a smile, and tears streamed down from the bottom of his heart. Then, he forced a smile and turned around. He knew it was time to start teaching, but for some reason, he was so tired. Chapter 693. As news of a hidden swordsmanship instructor spread throughout the Sword's Way domain, more and more players learned the method to gather sword intent from this instructor. More players set foot on the path to the Sword Dao domain in search of the hidden sword art mentor. During that period of time, the players who received sword instruction and understood sword will generously praise the hidden sword instructor on the forum. For example, the bald instructor was as diligent as a gardener. He carefully taught me a flower that would become a wall hanging in the future. To thank him, when I finished my studies, his eyes were filled with tears. His gaze was filled with gratification, joy, relief, and many other emotions. I could feel the holy light of an educator from him. I wanted to respectfully call him teacher, and so on and so forth. If Sui knew about this, he would probably die from anger on the spot. To hell with the glory of being an educator. To hell with being a teacher. I've had enough. He had sent away hundreds of players and helped these swordsmen who had learned crooked paths to become sword cultivators. Only he knew how sad he was during this period of time. He wanted to give up several times and cruelly kill all these stupid swordsmen. However, whenever he thought of the supreme inheritance left behind by the underworld swordsmen, he chose to endure it silently, because he was unwilling to give up such a great opportunity. This was a shortcut on his path to becoming an ancient god. This little bit of difficulty was nothing. Because of this, he secretly swore that no matter how difficult it was, he would definitely overcome it and obtain everything he wanted in the end, because he was the only and most legitimate successor of the Yellow Spring Swordsman, and he would also be the future Yellow Spring Swordsman. For this reason, Suya had thought of many ways to hide from the players. With his speed, he could leave in an instant, and the players wouldn't even be able to touch his shadow. However, there were too many players. Every time he found a precious sword well left behind by the underworld swordsman, he would stop and challenge it, shatter it, and absorb the essence of the sword well within. This was the most dangerous moment for Sui Yi. The danger did not come from the battle against the powerful sword seals. With his sword god imprint, he could easily defeat these shattered sword seals. In fact, the danger often came from the short pause in the process of absorbing the sword intent. Whenever this happened, there would always be a player popping out from somewhere and excitedly issuing a challenge. After a few hundred rounds of teaching, Suya was completely numb and gave up on resisting. What else could he do? There were only 3 paths in front of him. 1. Directly kill the challenger and be deprived of a strand of sword intent. 2nd. Accept the challenge. Wait for the other party to release his sword intent, defeat him, and kill him. 3rd. Teach the challenger how to use the sword will. Then wait for the challenger to release the sword will, defeat him, and kill him. These three paths seemed like they had a choice, but in reality, they had no choice at all. If he chose one, it would be equivalent to giving up on the many sword wills of the underworld swordsman. Then what was the point of staying here? If he chose the second option, there would be no follow-up at all. He would have to wait patiently. It might take an entire day or even longer. Sui Yi even suspected that these swordsmen who had picked up the wrong path would never be able to learn the method of condensing sword intent without his guidance. He naturally couldn't waste his energy on this. Moreover, enduring and waiting for such a long time wasn't beneficial to the cultivation of his sword heart. Therefore, if he wanted to obtain the underworld sword venerable's inheritance, he only had one choice. That was to teach these foolish swordsmen how to properly use sword essence, and then kill them. This was the only way to lose nothing and not waste a lot of time waiting. Although the process was mentally and emotionally exhausting, Sui Yi endured it for the sake of his inheritance. If you've picked up the wrong path, I'll teach you. I'll straighten out the path of a sword cultivator, and then hurry up and die. Sui Yi even realized to his dismay that he was gradually becoming more and more adept at teaching others how to comprehend sword intent. He even came up with his own teaching system of condensing sword intent, which could point out the path of a foolish swordsman in a short period of time and help him condense sword intent. He could even quickly come up with targeted teaching plans based on different personalities, emotional changes, and other characteristics, allowing different swordsmen to comprehend different sword wills. What Sui Yi found even harder to accept was that he actually felt happy about it, because with these experiences, he could save a lot of time and spend it on comprehending the sword will left behind by the underworld swordsman. How lowly of a happiness! As one of the 8 sword envoys, he actually felt happy that he could save time teaching others to comprehend sword intent faster. What the hell, I don't want this lowly happiness at all. However, there were some things that could not be solved by resisting. After all, there was a huge number of players who were invading the field of swordsmanship from all angles. Although there were countless deaths and injuries, they could still meet Sui Yi in the thick fog if they were lucky. This was not something that Sui Yi could not meet, even if he did not want to. As for the grievance and pain in Sui Yi's heart, the players had no idea. They only felt that the hidden character was really too strong. After searching the forum for a long time and finding a bunch of guides and teaching videos, they could not learn anything even after racking their brains for a few days. With just a few words, this bald instructor could help them understand the essence of it and draw inferences about other things from one instance. Finally, their hearts were clear and they could condense their own sword will. To the players, this was much better than professional players like Mujioga. This was a true professional. If it was not for the end of the hidden plot after comprehending sword intent and triggering the final Easter egg, the bald instructor would have killed them on the spot. The players even had the urge to continue listening to him so that they could go further on the path of a sword cultivator. After all, knowledge from the outside world had to be paid. This was something that the battle players knew very well. Apart from the internal library of the Mansion of the Dead, which was free, any knowledge from the outside world had to be purchased with soul coins. For example, every knowledge accumulation and improvement in life professions was gained through countless practices. Putting it into practice required a lot of soul coins. Another example would be the Illusion Fish Clan stealth technique, Tong Gua's smithing technique, and so on. If specialized guidance was required, these would also need to be purchased with soul coins. Only in the field of swordsmanship could the bald instructor provide free and enthusiastic guidance. It was impossible to find someone like him in any other place. Therefore, the players cherished this opportunity very much and did not want to miss the opportunity to learn. Apart from the warrior players, some mages and assassins also joined the craze of cultivating sword will. They all sailed to the field of swordsmanship in search of the bald instructor. According to what they said, why couldn't mages learn sword will? If I learned sword will, I would be able to use my sword to fight against others in close combat. I could even pretend to be a pig to eat a tiger and counterattack. Wouldn't that be great? The assassin players had the same thought. They felt that why the warrior players could learn it, but they couldn't. Flying on a sword like Ao Jian was also their dream. What was worse was that the healer players thought so too. Why couldn't the healer attack? Usually, when there was a battle, the opponent would kill the healer players first. Why couldn't they have the ability to protect themselves? Therefore, the number of students who wanted to learn sword was still increasing. Sui's moment of despair was far from over. During this period, Ao Jian's sword was also getting stronger day by day. The sword was supported by passion, had the characteristic of not being worn down. It seemed weak, but it was almost invincible in this field of swordsmanship. Not only did each failure not weaken Ao Jian's sword will, it would also strengthen as Ao Jian comprehended new sword will. For almost 2 months, Ao Jian did not go offline even once. Relying on the support of the nutrient solution, he continuously challenged and was challenged in the field of swordsmanship. Perhaps to other swordsmen, this place was extremely dangerous, and one wrong step could cost them their lives. However, to Ao Jian, this place was more like a library. Every sword will had its own story, and at this moment, he seemed to be wandering in this sea of books, enriching his experience and knowledge. After reading over and over again, he comprehended many exquisite sword wills left by the underworld swordsman. Until now, he had encountered a total of 168 sword wills, and he had comprehended all of them. As a result, his heart of the sword had become extremely firm, and his sword will had recovered to the stage when he first cultivated Relentless Sword. After abandoning Relentless Sword, Ao Jian thought that his sword will would progress slowly by relying on passion alone, and perhaps it would be a long time before he could return to his peak again. Even he did not expect to encounter the field of swordsmanship at this time. Everything could be said to be a blessing in disguise, so Ao Jian cherished such an opportunity. Due to the large number of sword wills accumulated by the underworld swordsman, Ao Jian especially cherished every sword will he encountered during his journey and would stop to comprehend them. At this moment, after wandering around the outer circle, Ao Jian moved his mind, and the boat slowly sailed into the field of swordsmanship. While moving forward, Ao Jian would occasionally see swordsmen fighting with swordsmen, swordsmen fighting with sword seals, and even sword seals fighting with sword seals. The collision of different sword wills stirred up countless waves of sword will. However, Ao Jian had long been used to this, so he turned a blind eye to it. His heart of the sword was feeling the aura of sword will coming from the surroundings, and he was looking for the next target. The boat broke through the heavy fog, and at this moment, several figures appeared in the distance. Ao Jian was immediately ready for the sword will battle. However, when the boat broke through the fog and saw everything in front of him, he could not help but be stunned. Such a harmonious scene was really a little unexpected. He saw a group of players squatting on the raft, huddled together, and listening to a bald man's words with a look of obedient children. Just as Ao Jian was feeling astonished, the bald man who was speaking suddenly looked at him. At this moment, Roving Sword sensed a strong sword will. The strength of this sword will was something that Ao Jian had never seen in his life. He was sure that this person was definitely an extraordinary and peerless swordsman. Just from the sword light revealed in his eyes, Ao Jian could roughly judge the strength of this person. It was not something that he could contend with, and even 10 of him would not be enough. Newcomer, hurry up and learn the sword. The lesson just started. At this moment, Sui Yi waved at Ao Jian in the distance and shouted. Sui Yi, who had already learned to gather the players to teach, was giving a public lesson. He said this with a smile on his face, as if he wanted to show that he was very kind. Hearing this, Ao Jian was confused. Did something happen? Chapter 694. Looking at the players who were sitting in rows on a raft, Ao Jian was astonished. Along the way in the field of sword Dao, he encountered cruel scenes of mutual attacks, so he was really surprised to see such a harmonious scene at this moment. Especially when he noticed that the players were looking at the man with the giant sword with curiosity in their eyes. He felt that the scene did not match the environment he was in. What are you waiting for? Hurry up and come to class. Sui Yi was displeased. He was thinking of finishing the class as soon as possible so that he could continue to comprehend the sword Dao. He didn't want to waste any more precious time here. Ao Jian was stunned. After some thought, he steered the small boat closer to the raft to see what they were up to. The players on the raft were also astonished when they saw that it was Ao Jian. Almost all the players on the original server knew about Ao Jian. After all, he was one of the most famous members of the cheat group. His battle videos were included in the top teaching strategies in the battle skills category. He was recognized as a top-notch powerhouse by the players. Therefore, everyone subconsciously made way for him when they saw Ao Jian. At this moment, Roving Sword leaped up from the water and landed on the raft. He stood in a corner and did not choose to squeeze with the players. Seeing that, Sui nodded in satisfaction. He looked at the players who were looking up at him and said solemnly, "All right, let's continue with the detailed explanation of the sword Dao. All right, let's continue with the detailed explanation of swordsmanship. I hope that everyone can listen carefully. If there's anything you don't understand, feel free to ask me. I will answer them in detail." Seeing that everyone was ready, Sui continued his lecture on the sword Dao. Sui was already familiar with the knowledge and could infer many things from one instance. He would even subconsciously ask the players if they understood during the lecture. Sometimes he would repeat the key points twice to ensure the quality of the lecture. He would even pick a few players to answer his questions to ensure that they really understood and were not just brushing him off. In order to save time, Sui could be said to have mastered the essence of the teacher's lecture. Moreover, Sui's resentful gaze when he met stupid students almost made some of the players suspect that they were back in school again. They were even a little nervous. The difference was that Sui seemed to be more enthusiastic than the teachers and always cared if the players had learned it or not. Also, Sui didn't know her teacher's trump card, "Call your parents over tomorrow," so Sui would feel that he was very kind when they got along. The players were very touched by the bald teacher who was trying his best. Sui was even more touched by the increasing number of students. He almost cried. The class soon ended. As Sui smiled in relief, the players gathered a weak sword will one after another. As for the students who still didn't understand, Sui began to teach them individually, striving to make sure that all of them could pass and condense their graduation certificate, sword will. When all 38 of them had condensed their sword will, Sui looked at the last person, Ao Jian. "Where's your sword intent? Haven't you learned it yet? Did you pay attention to my lecture just now? Even if you're stupid, why didn't you ask questions during the Q&A session just now?" At this moment, Sui was so angry that he almost took out a blackboard and drew out the key points to vent his anger. Ao Jian. As a matter of fact, he listened very attentively when Sui was teaching. Although Sui was talking about the basic knowledge of sword cultivation, there were still many differences between what Ao Jian had learned and what he had learned. What shocked Ao Jian the most was that the content of Sui's lecture was all about the key points of the method of condensing sword will. There were no lengthy lectures or other irrelevant knowledge points. It could be said that the content was refined to the extreme. Ao Jian admitted that he couldn't do that. After the lecture, Ao Jian also felt that he had benefited a lot, and many of his thoughts became clear. This caused him to think even more highly of Sui's attainments in the sword Dao. Sui was absolutely a grandmaster in the sword Dao, just as he'd thought. "Are you listening to me?" Ao Jian raised his head after his thoughts were interrupted. He looked at Sui's disappointed eyes and decided to condense his sword will after some thought. In an instant, the new sword will that was integrated with nearly 200 sword wills was filled with the aura of many sword mysteries. Sui immediately realized that it was extraordinary. "You've already comprehended sword will." "No, you've already devoured many sword wills in the realm." Sui's expression changed when he saw this. He initially thought that Ao Jian was like the players in front of him, a newbie swordsman who had learned the wrong things. He did not expect that Ao Jian had already comprehended sword will and devoured many sword wills left by the underworld sword lord that he regarded as his own. At this moment, Sui felt that he had been fooled. He immediately became angry out of humiliation. However, no matter what, these people had to die. This was because all the swordsmen in the realm were Sui's competitors, and the final winner could only be himself. With that thought in mind, Sui wasted no more time and unleashed an incredibly vast sword will wave from his body, blowing away the player's sword wills as if they were twigs. Then, he swung his greatsword and killed every single one of the players. However, when the sword aura was about to fall on Ao Jian, who was standing in the corner, Sui Ye's expression froze, and he suddenly withdrew the sword aura he released. This was because he realized that Ao Jian's sword will had yet to disperse. In other words, Ao Jian had yet to be defeated in the battle of sword wills. If Ao Jian was killed by the sword aura at this moment, all the remaining sword wills that he had obtained after working hard for nearly 2 months in the realm would be taken away. This was absolutely unacceptable to Sui Yi. After a cold snort, Sui Yi condensed his own sword will again and collided with Ao Jian's sword will. Bang! As expected, Ao Jian's sword will was instantly destroyed when it collided with the sword will that Sui Yi condensed from the sword principle divine seal. It could not resist at all. However, when Sui Yi was about to attack again to kill Ao Jian, a new wave of sword will suddenly appeared on Ao Jian's body. At this moment, Sui Yi's face was filled with disbelief. Sword will reassembled. Sui Yi, who did not believe it, attacked again and shattered Ao Jian's seemingly weak sword will. However, Ao Jian's expression remained the same. The new sword will in his body rapidly reassembled and grew like mushrooms after the rain. The moment it was formed, it did not weaken at all. When victory and defeat were no longer important, although Ao Jian's sword will was no longer as sharp and indomitable as it used to be, it had an additional characteristic: indestructible. The battle between sword wills was like comparing who was the sharpest spear. In the competition, one side would definitely be defeated. However, Ao Jian would not have such worries. The sword will that was condensed from his passion for the sword allowed him to ignore victory and defeat. No matter how strong it was, he would not be shaken by the breeze. However, such a characteristic sword will also had a great weakness. Its power was certainly not as strong as other sword wills. It could even be considered as the weakest sword will of the same level. When fighting with an opponent of the same realm, although his opponent could not destroy his sword will, he could definitely be killed. However, in this sword principle realm, the only thing that was competing with each other was sword will, not their own strength. Under the favorable conditions, Ao Jian was almost invincible here. As long as his body was not destroyed, his sword will would never be destroyed. Ao Jian relied on this characteristic to get stronger and stronger in the sword principle realm. He had also comprehended many sword wills to refine his body. Feeling the fluctuation of Ao Jian's sword will, Sui Ye's face was full of disbelief. This was a sword will that he had never seen before. Although it was sharp, there was no murderous aura. It was as if it was a reclusive person who had retreated from the mortal world and was not disturbed by the outside world. In the underworld, killing was for self-protection, for resistance, for promotion, and so on. No one could stay out of it. How could there be such a sword will? Sui Yi could not figure it out. Looking at Ao Jian, who had condensed his sword will again, Sui Yi, who did not believe it, showed a ferocious expression and began to attack Ao Jian's sword will again and again. Smash, condense, time passed bit by bit. After dozens of attempts, Sui Yi understood one thing, no matter how unbelievable it was. It was impossible for him to defeat Ao Jian's sword will. Because his sword will had no edge, it could not be defeated. Sui Yi, who realized this, was unwilling because there was only one choice in front of him. That was to kill Ao Jian. If Ao Jian was allowed to grow here, his potential would be immeasurable because his growth was based on being undefeated. No matter how slow his growth was, he would eventually grow to a terrifying realm by relying on the many sword wills left by the underworld swordsmen. At this moment, Sui Yi gave up the battle of sword will and decisively pulled out the giant sword on his back. He looked at Ao Jian and said, Sui Yi, have never accepted a disciple in my life because my sword will symbolize freedom and I don't want to have too many concerns. However, you're the only one who made me cherish talent. You're a person who truly loves swords. Apart from you, all the swordsmen I have met have their own pursuits and goals. None of them have such a pure love for swords like you. I want to take you as my sword disciple." After pausing for a while, Sui Yi continued to say, "But it's a pity that we met here. You're blocking my way forward." At this point, Sui Yi suddenly waved his hand, and a violent sword aura swept forward, shredding Ao Jin's body. After retrieving the giant sword, Sui Yi immediately felt a vast power of the sword principle descending upon him. It invaded the sword principle divine seal and began to deprive him of all the sword wills left by the underworld swordsman, because he had violated the rules of the battle of sword wills. Sui Yi's eyes were cold. He already knew the result the moment he made the decision. However, he did not regret his choice, because Ao Jin had to be eliminated. Otherwise, this person would be the biggest obstacle and competitor for him to obtain the inheritance of the underworld swordsman. When all the sword wills that he had painstakingly refined dissipated, Sui Yi could not help but sigh with a hint of regret in his eyes. However, he did not know whether the regret was due to Ao Jin's death or the dissipation of the condensed sword wills, or both. 3 hours later, in the Mansion of the Dead, Ao Jin's figure appeared in the resurrection area. When everything around him became clear, Ao Jin had a smile on his face. In reality, he did not have the intention to compete with Sui Yi for the inheritance. He only wanted to explore the endless mystery of sword wills. To him, the sword principle domain was like the library of the sword principle. It contained a lot of knowledge that he desired. It was very attractive to him, and he would not give it up. After trying to contact Mo Lanlan and Mo Xiaoxin, Ao Jin felt helpless when he still did not get a reply. He then walked toward the direction of the city gate and once again set foot on the path to the sword principle domain. Chapter 695. After killing Ao Jin, Sui Yi continued to explore the sword Dao domain, searching for and absorbing the sword will left behind by the underworld sword venerable. Along the way, his sword intent became stronger and stronger, and its sharpness was threatening. At this moment, Sui Yi could release sword aura with just his gaze. His entire body was filled with a terrifying sharpness. However, whenever he encountered other players, Sui Yi's cold aura would be instantly shattered, and he could only be a teacher obediently. After all, it was not easy to obtain the sword will. He could not violate the taboo of the domain again. During this period of time, Sui Yi had no idea how many disciples he had taught. From private lessons to public lessons, his teaching skills were getting more and more solid. However, Sui Yi was not happy at all. He was also filled with doubts. He really wanted to know how the sword master in this sea region, who misled the students, managed to trick so many idiots into learning the method of condensing sword will from him. Of course, he had no way of knowing. However, he was prepared to find that sword master once he inherited the sword venerable's inheritance. He would teach him a lesson and let him know what professionalism was, and then kill him in the cruelest way possible. As he continued to move forward into the sword Dao domain, Sui Yi gradually felt the pressure. Although the sword Dao divine seal kept getting stronger, the closer he got to the center, the more complete the sword seals he encountered. Just now, he encountered a complete sword seal. Wave-breaking sword seal. This sword seal formed by sword was obtained by the sword venerable after he was apotheosized. It was essentially no different from his own divine seal. Although the sword venerable was no longer controlling it, the explosive power of this sword seal still made it difficult for Sui Yi to deal with. As the sword wills clashed, they were even for a short period of time. Fortunately, he won in the end. He shattered the sword seal, absorbed it, and converted it. However, Sui Yi dared not be careless after this encounter, because the sword venerable's sword was far more than that. Thinking of the sword venerable's 3 most powerful techniques and the sea god sword that he finally learned from the sword Dao law, Sui Yi knew that he had to improve his strength here as soon as possible. With this thought in mind, Sui Yi continued to wander around the center of the domain and began to search for sword wills. He would challenge and absorb them, trying his best to grow his sword will so that he could face stronger opponents. During this period, Roving Sword also stepped into the sword Dao domain. However, his comprehension of sword intent did not start from scratch. Although there was a law in the sword principle field, this law could be said to be above all swordsmen and sword seals. All those who broke the law and failed would have all the sword essences they had obtained here taken away. However, Ao Jian was different. Because he was a player, his backer was Lu Wu, and his soul was the battle artifact that was imprinted in Lu Wu's hand. Although the rule of the sword was strong, it was absolutely impossible to invade Ao Jian's soul as a player and deprive him of the power he had obtained. Lu Wu, have you asked me? Therefore, even though he was killed, his sword intent was not affected at all and was firmly preserved. Once again stepping into the field of swordsmanship, Ao Jian immediately steered the boat deeper into the field. However, challenges soon came to him. This time, it was not Sword Seal who challenged Ao Jian, but countless swordsmen who entered the field of swordsmanship after hearing the news. At this time, the outermost wandering sword seals had basically been divided up by the swordsmen, so their targets had changed from sword seals to other swordsmen. Relying on the enhancement of the sword Dao domain, they could completely deprive others of their sword intent to enhance themselves. Although it was very cruel to do so, it was nothing in the face of benefits. In order to obtain the final victory, many swordsmen had already given up their bottom line as long as they could become stronger. Ao Jian faced this calmly because he was not afraid of any challenge at all. During this period, apart from the swordsmen, Ao Jian often met players. However, these players obviously had no intention of challenging him. They would try to greet him when they saw him and then leave in a hurry. It seemed that they were looking for something. Along the way, Ao Jian also saw many sword intent battles between the players and the swordsmen. However, it was obvious that the players would not play by the rules. Often, after losing the sword intent battle, they would raise their fists, wands, and so on, and immediately fight their opponents head-on. This was because they did not have the habit of waiting for death. As for the rules, the player clan never followed the rules. Ao Jian was not surprised by this and continued to calmly board the boat and go deeper. After 3 days, the boat pushed through the heavy fog and arrived at the area where he died. At this time, Sui had already left. The surroundings were quiet, and there was a faint sound of rippling water. Looking at the small map in the upper right corner, Ao Jian did not stop and chose to continue moving forward. The boat moved forward very slowly. During this period, Ao Jian constantly used his sword heart to explore the surroundings to feel if there was any fluctuation of sword intent. The deeper he went, Ao Jian found that the number of swordsmen decreased and the number of sword seals also decreased. However, every time he encountered a swordsman or sword seal, it would be a difficult battle. However, this aroused Ao Jian's inner enthusiasm, because the more profound the sword intent, the more he wanted to explore and understand. Relying on the characteristic of the immortal sword intent, Ao Jian comprehended several sword intents left by the underworld sword venerable, while the boat gradually approached the central area of the domain. The water rippled and the fog filled the air. Ao Jian carried the 9 spiritual swords on his back and comprehended with his eyes closed. Suddenly, 2 powerful sword essences came from afar, and Ao Jian opened his eyes. Following the direction of the sword intents, Ao Jian moved his mind, and the boat immediately sailed in that direction. Pushing through the heavy fog, 2 figures appeared in front of Ao Jian. One of them was very familiar to him. It was Sui. The other person was wrapped in golden light, and his face was blurred. He was floating on the water with his hands behind his back. In front of them, a giant green sword and a small golden sword were colliding and fighting. The dispersing sword was so powerful that just the aftermath had instantly destroyed the sword in Ao Jian's body that was approaching. Seeing the 2 people fighting, Ao Jian immediately stopped moving forward and began to watch from afar. During the fight, Sui's forehead was dripping with sweat, and he seemed to be struggling. The other figure did not move at all. It was easy to tell who had the upper hand. The fight lasted for about an hour. Suddenly, Sui took a few steps back with a pale face. The giant green sword trembled and made a sword sound. "Old thing, you're already dead." Why don't you let me inherit your swordsmanship? Sui Yi looked at the golden figure and scolded angrily. I've told you before that you're not suitable to inherit my swordsmanship. When he heard that, Sui Ye's face twisted, and he looked unwilling to give up. My swordsmanship is the sword of freedom. It's unrestrained and can smelt any sword intent. Why can't I? Freedom itself already represents a kind of main sword intent attribute. You should explore and break through the path in the future by yourself, instead of looking for shortcuts. Only then can you go further. I don't need it. I only want your sword intent. Sui Yi roared angrily. Hearing this, the golden figure sighed and waved his hand. The small golden sword shot out and knocked the giant green sword back into Sui Ye's hand. Retreat. Anyone can obtain my sword intent, but only you can't. At this moment, Sui Ye's face showed a touch of desolation. The reason why he was not allowed to inherit the swordsmanship inheritance was so that he could go further. He could not accept this reason. Sui Ye's eyes gradually turned red. Then, he suddenly threw the giant sword in his hand. Suddenly, thousands of sword intent phantoms condensed around him and hit the small golden sword with the giant sword. Boom! The powerful sword intent fluctuations caused the sea to surge. Ao Jian, who was far away, was also affected. The sword intent that was formed was instantly erased. Since you don't want to give it to me, I'll take it from you. I couldn't do anything to you when you were alive, but now I'm the one in charge. Boom! Accompanied by Sui Ye's roar, a giant green sword cut through the barrier of the swordsmanship domain and descended from the sky, piercing the golden figure. So powerful! Feeling the sword intent aura, Ao Jian was horrified. Old thing, die for me. The giant sword collided with the golden figure. Dazzling lights flashed, and the golden figure quickly melted under the blow, revealing its real body. At this moment, Ao Jian was shocked to find that it was a sword seal and not a real person. Feeling puzzled, Ao Jian immediately looked at the golden sword seal and activated his analysis ability. See God's sword complete. Sword intent details. One of the three venerables of the Netherworld Chamber of Commerce, the strongest sword intent in Venerable Sword's life. After breaking through to the ancient God realm, Venerable Sword once stepped into the Central Sea territory near the six paths of reincarnation to comprehend a sword intent that matched his realm. He cultivated in seclusion for 5,000 years, integrated all the sword intents of the sea attribute, and created his own sword intent, Sea God Sword. Sword intent level, rule sword intent. When the Sea God Sword seal collided with the giant sword condensed by Sui Yi, countless golden lights flashed. The golden sword intent continued to solidify and push back the giant sword bit by bit. Boom! The giant sword could not withstand the impact, and cracks appeared on its surface. However, Sui Yi still clenched his teeth and persevered. Even though he knew the consequences of failure would be a setback to his sword intent, he still wanted to win, and he had to win. Because this was a shortcut. As long as he succeeded, he would be the next venerable sword of the Acheron Chamber of Commerce. This was the peak that he longed for the most, and it was also the peak that he had been pursuing all his life. Stop! If you continue, your sword intent will shatter. At this moment, a voice came from beside him, causing Sui Ye's heart to tremble. He immediately turned around and was shocked to find that this person was the swordsman that he had killed some time ago. Wasn't he dead? Sui Ye's mind was in a mess, and the giant sword condensed by his sword intent was pushed back by the golden sword seal. The giant sword that was covered with cracks flew back to Sui Yi, and was then absorbed into his body. Sui Yi then turned around to look at Ao Jian and said coldly, "You're not dead?" Ao Jian nodded, "Not dead. Why are you stopping me now?" Even an outsider like me can see that if you continue, you'll definitely lose, and your sword intent will definitely be affected. I don't know why you're persevering in a battle of sword intent where you're bound to lose, but I can see that you know the owner of this sword seal. So you seem to be taking a gamble, betting that the owner will choose to compromise. Sui Ye's heart skipped a beat, and his face was filled with disbelief. Because what Ao Jian said was exactly what he was thinking. If it was an external enemy, he would definitely compromise in a situation where he was bound to lose, and the owner even gave him a way out. The reason why he was so persistent this time was that he was gambling that the sword seal that still had the consciousness of the venerable sword would compromise. Give up. I can feel the emotions in this sword seal. Even if you have a close relationship with the owner of this sword seal isn't the real body after all, and the consciousness left by the owner is only a part of it. It's not as simple as you think. If you lose the gamble, you'll be destroying yourself. Hearing this, Sui's expression was complicated, and his eyes were filled with uncertainty. He subconsciously turned his head to look at the sword seal. At this moment, the sword seal had once again turned into a blurry golden figure. It looked familiar, but lacked a lot of meaning. How can you feel the emotions in the sword seal? How did you do it? Sui turned his head to look at Ao Jian and asked. The repeated failures in this area allowed me to understand every sword seal more thoroughly. Just like that, I gradually comprehended this ability through the contact with the sword seal. Ao Jian answered without hiding anything. Chapter 696. Sui was shocked by Ao Jian's words. If what Ao Jian said was true, it meant that he could comprehend the sword essence that Sui had yet to comprehend. That was incredible to Sui. He also absorbed the underworld sword Venerable's sword essence in the sword principle field, but he defeated it, then absorbed and digested it. Although it was simple and crude, it was also very effective. However, Ao Jian, who relied on repeated failures to understand the sword essence in the sword seal and then comprehend the essence, had already surpassed him in terms of realm and level. Sui thought that he was talented, and he could do it too. However, it required a lot of time and experience, and he could not do it as easily as Ao Jian. So at this moment, Sui looked at Ao Jian differently. Reading the sword seal and comprehending the essence of the sword essence. Could it be that he could fit with any sword essence? Then how did he forge his sword heart? Sui was full of doubts and found the key to the problem. From Sui's point of view, it had nothing to do with the talent of sword essence, but the sword heart. A swordsman's sword heart was the foundation. The sword essence was the power condensed by the sword heart, and the sword chi was the materialization of the released power. The sword heart affected the attribute of the sword essence, and the sword essence affected the power of the sword chi. They were closely related. Since Ao Jian could fit with any sword essence, he must have a sword heart that could bear the sword essence of any attribute. Just when Sui was puzzled, Ao Jian suddenly looked at Sui and said, "Do you want me to try?" Sui naturally knew what Ao Jian meant by try. Absolutely impossible. He immediately opened his mouth and chose to refuse. He even had the urge to kill Ao Jian with his sword again. Such a hidden danger would always be a threat if it was not removed. However, Sui knew that he could not do that now, because he could not defeat the Sea God Sword Seal. If he killed Ao Jian here, he would be deprived of a large amount of hard-earned sword essence. By then, he would not be a match for the Sea God Sword Seal. Ao Jian thought about it, took a step back, and made a gesture of please. Seeing Ao Jian's action, Sui's face turned pale. After listening to Ao Jian's words, he was no longer as determined as before, so he naturally did not want to go forward and be thwarted. The atmosphere suddenly became awkward. After a while, Sui suddenly asked the question in his mind, "Why are you still alive?" Sui was sure that Ao Jian must have been killed by him. Otherwise, the punishment from the sword principle law would not have appeared. Although the indestructible sword will shocked him, he could barely accept it. However, the resurrection of the dead was very strange, and he couldn't think of any reason for it. "You want to learn? I'll teach you." Ao Ran smiled. "You?" Sui raised his giant sword in anger, but then put it down again, choosing to endure it. Thinking about how he had told Ao Jian that he wanted to take him as a sword disciple, Sui felt that Ao Jian's words were extremely ironic. "Actually, even if you don't let me try, I still have to try. I'm looking forward to the sword essence of the rule." Ao Jian looked at the sword master mockingly, and then walked towards the Sea God Sword Seal. Seeing this, Sui suddenly raised the giant sword in his hand and pointed it at Ao Jian. This was his inheritance. All competitors who wanted it had to die. However, no matter how ruthless Sui was, he couldn't swing his sword. This was because the price to pay was too great. If he lost these precious sword wills, it would take a long time to get them back. After hesitating for a moment, Sui stared at Ao Jian fiercely, put the giant sword back on his back, and watched coldly. He didn't believe that Ao Jian could get the Sea God Sword seal. Even if his sword heart could contain all the attributes of sword will, it was impossible, because he was sure that Ao Jian couldn't bear such a vast sword essence of the rule. After all, whether the sword heart could integrate with the sword will was one thing, and whether it could contain it was another thing. Sui kept comforting himself, and at the same time, he cursed Ao Jian with his eyes. He couldn't get it. Naturally, Ao Jian didn't care about the look behind him. He calmly walked to the front of the Sea God's sword essence, and then issued a sword will challenge. Unlike Sui, the Sea God sword essence didn't talk too much with him, and directly launched an attack. At this moment, Ao Jian felt that the world in front of him had changed. Everything in front of him was spinning crazily. When it became clear again, Ao Jian found that he had become a skinny little boy. Ao Jian immediately raised his head and looked around. He was shocked to find that he was surrounded by endless yellow sand, and the sky was full of sand and dust. At this moment, Ao Jian suddenly felt very thirsty. He subconsciously licked his dry and cracked lips, and only felt that his throat was about to smoke. Looking up at the scorching sun above his head, Ao Jian tried to concentrate and get out of this illusion. However, no matter how hard he tried, nothing in front of him changed. "I'm so thirsty." At this moment, Ao Jian felt that he was very close to death, and a strong desire to survive was born in his body. He began to search the surroundings, looking for a water source. However, there was endless yellow sand around him, and there was no water source. Under the scorching sun, Ao Jian finally couldn't hold on any longer and suddenly fell to the ground. At this moment, a figure appeared in front of him. It was an old man who was as skinny as him, but his haggard face revealed a strong desire to survive. The old man didn't say anything, but reached out to carry him, and then began to walk forward step by step. After an unknown period of time, Ao Jian was put down after a bumpy journey. At this moment, Ao Jian only felt that his vision was blurred, and it was a vast expanse of whiteness. His perception of the outside world also became unclear. At this moment, a mouthful of coolness was suddenly poured into his mouth. Ao Jian immediately began to desperately absorb this coolness, as if he was absorbing life force. After a while, Ao Jian slowly recovered and finally saw everything around him clearly again. At this moment, he found himself in a cliff pit, and the old man was grabbing a vine-like plant, twisting it hard. The coolness from before was also the liquid that dripped from this plant. Seeing that Ao Jian had woken up, the old man grinned, and then looked at the plant with a strong desire in his eyes. He then threw it into his mouth and chewed it little by little. Ao Jian didn't say anything and looked around. He really wanted to know how he fell into such a realistic illusion when he was obviously in a confrontation of sword will. At this moment, the old man spat out the plant residue, stood up, carried Ao Jian, and walked out of the cliff pit again. He faced the sandstorm and continued to move forward. Ao Jian didn't speak during this journey, and he didn't know how long he had been dehydrated. Whenever he spoke, his throat would hurt and itch, and he could only make a noise. Along the way, the day and night changed 5 times, and the environment along the way was very harsh. The temperature difference between day and night was huge, like the difference between ice and fire. The old man had been taking care of him and struggled to move forward with him. During this period, the old man also fell down several times, but he still struggled to stand up and carried Ao Jian forward. Ao Jian couldn't imagine how this thin and weak body could nurture such a powerful force, and what was it that supported him to move forward. Moreover, Ao Jian found that his body seemed to be different from a human's, and it would adjust according to the environment. If it was a human body, he suspected that he would have died long ago. On the 18th day, after enduring the extremely cold night, the sky was dimly lit and the temperature was getting warmer. The old man carried Ao Jian again and continued this journey that seemed to have no end. However, halfway through the day, the old man suddenly fell down again. Ao Jian silently watched the old man, waiting for him to stubbornly get up again. However, this time, the old man didn't get up again. Instead, he raised his head and said in an extremely hoarse and harsh voice, "I'll move ahead, CC." At this moment, the old man's dim eyes burst out with indescribable desire and expectation. See? Ao Jian's heart trembled. At this moment, he knew what the old man's purpose was. Was he looking for the sea? The old man slowly stretched out his hands, trembling as he grabbed the air in front of him. "Amu, see." Ao Jian couldn't bear it and stood up tremblingly. He wanted to help the old man up and move forward. At this moment, the old man's arms hung down weakly, but before he died, there was still an infinite desire for the sea left in his eyes. Looking at the old man whose eyes were full of hope, Ao Jian was silent, and he didn't feel good. At this moment, the scene in front of Ao Jian suddenly changed rapidly. In the blink of an eye, he found that he had become a 13 or 14-year-old teenager, and his body was no longer shriveled, although he still looked very thin. Everything that happened just now was like a dream. Thinking of this, Ao Jian immediately looked around and was surprised to find that he was on an island. In the distance, there was a golden beach, a turquoise sea, and the rustling sound of the waves hitting the reefs. Everything seemed so beautiful. However, before Ao Jian could react, a figure suddenly appeared beside him, and then a whip was lashed on his body. Slacking off again, hurry up and get to work. Ao Jian felt a burning pain on his back after being whipped. He immediately wanted to take action, but before he could stand up completely, he was kicked to the ground. Subsequently, the whip lashed down continuously, and Ao Jian's skin and flesh were lacerated, dripping with blood. The attack was extremely heavy. In the end, Ao Jian fainted. After an unknown period of time, when Ao Jian woke up, he found himself in a dark cave, and the clanking sound of metal hitting stones could be heard continuously. He immediately struggled to get up and began to observe his surroundings. Suddenly, he found that there were many thinly dressed figures using tools similar to pickaxes, knocking on a kind of dark blue stone that was embedded in the rock wall. Every time they knocked off a piece, they would skillfully throw it into the wooden bucket behind them. At this moment, a figure appeared beside Ao Jian. Then Ao Jian felt a pain in his chest, and he was whipped again. Get to work. The familiar voice belonged to the person who whipped him until he fainted. Naturally, Ao Jian was unwilling to give in. He glared at that person, and just as he expected, the whip lashed again, and he fainted again. When he woke up again, Ao Jian found himself still in the dark mine shaft, and the supervisor with the whip in his hand was still there. Once again, his tenacious vitality allowed him to survive. When he woke up this time, Ao Jian realized that he was very eager to live. This feeling did not come from his heart, but from the feedback of his body. It was just like in the previous illusion, when he was absorbing the cool liquid that dripped from the plants, and he was extremely eager. Therefore, when the supervisor with the whip looked at him, Ao Jian did not hesitate to pick up the pickaxe on the ground and walk towards the busy crowd. This time, the work lasted for a few months, and during this period, Ao Jian had thought of going offline. However, the game notification was frowny face game notification. You are in a state of sword will confrontation, and you cannot exit. Forcefully exiting will cause the sword will confrontation to fail, and you will be forced to exit as a penalty, a large amount of experience and soul coins. Do you want to forcefully exit? Ao Jian, who really wanted to understand the rule of sword will, had no choice but to continue doing hard work. At the same time, he was guessing what this illusion had to do with the rule of sword will. During this period, Ao Jian suddenly had a guess. Could it be that I am experiencing the past of the underworld sword lord? Chapter 697. He had been in the dreamland for nearly 2 months. During this period, Aojian had never left the island. It was not that he did not want to go out, but he could not go out at all. He could only work in the dark mineshaft day after day. This kind of life made Aojian feel very annoyed, but he did not want to give up his desire for the sword essence of the law. During these 2 months, Aojian also tried to think about the reason for the existence of this dreamland. At this time, there were many speculations in his mind. Aojian felt that the most likely guess was that what he was experiencing now was the path that the underworld sword venerable had once walked. He still clearly remembered that when he was in the desert, the old man pointed to the distance with his trembling hand and shouted, "See, Amu!" See, Aojian's analysis was that the old man wanted to take him to find the sea. However, in the end, the old man was exhausted and could no longer hold on. Although there was a longing for the sea in his eyes, he was eventually buried in the yellow sand. Thinking of his current appearance of 13 or 14 years old, it was obvious that he had grown up compared to before. Could it be that after the old man died, the young man set off again, relying on his tenacious will and extremely adaptable body to finally arrive at the seaside? Later on, for some unknown reason, he was taken to this island and became a slave. Aojian had no way of knowing whether this was the case, but if his guess was correct, then this trip to the dreamland would certainly not be ordinary. With such a mood, Aojian was looking forward to it. Every day, he made guesses and deliberated while working. During the days here, Aojian also found a very strange thing, which was that he had forgotten any cultivation method of sword essence. He originally wanted to rely on the knowledge of swordsmanship in his mind and the rich spiritual energy around him to recultivate so that he could have the strength to protect himself. However, all the knowledge of swordsmanship had disappeared from his mind, as if this memory was deliberately blocked. All of this made Aojian puzzled, and he could only wait for what might happen next. Another month passed as they waited. The days of mining were undoubtedly boring. Although they did not have to worry about food and drink every day, in order to ensure their efficiency, a large amount of food will be sent to them every day. However, living in such an environment for a long time had a huge impact on their spirit. The eyes of the laborers beside him were lifeless, as if they had long given up resisting and had completely become tools. The reason why Aojian was able to hold on was that he had expectations in his heart and knew that all of this was fake. On this day, the sun rose. Aojian and the laborers were driven into the mine as usual and continued to work below. Halfway through his work, before it was time to eat, the ground suddenly shook and gravel fell from the mine. The sudden change shocked Aojian. The supervisor who was patrolling not far away was also shocked. He then shouted at Aojian and the others, "Continue working, don't be lazy," and walked out of the mine. Aojian was confused about this, but he did not stubbornly follow them out to have a look. After all, this place was heavily guarded and surrounded by the boundless sea. Relying on his strength, which had not even reached the ghost soldier realm, to escape was also a dead end. Soon, shouts and explosions could be heard from outside. It seemed like an intense battle was going on. Hearing these sounds, Aojian tried to communicate with the laborers around him. However, in the face of Aojian's words, these laborers looked numb and did not pay attention to him at all. While waiting, the sounds of fighting outside gradually calmed down, and at this time, a figure walked into the mine. This person was not the supervisor that Aojian was familiar with, but a very burly man in green armor. "From today onwards, you are the laborers of my Iron Snake Island. Do you understand?" Hearing this, Aojian's face showed a look of realization. Fighting for resources? He also had some understanding of the history of this world from the forum. He knew that there were endless plundering and competition because of resources, and this was even the main theme of this world. It was indeed normal for a battle to break out because of resources. In the face of the man's question, Aojian and the laborers did not answer. They just looked at the man quietly, their faces were numb. After being taken over by the Iron Snake Island, although Aogn was still a laborer, his days in the future had changed. The daily workload was 3 times heavier, and the time for sleep and rest was compressed by 3 times. This was completely an act of squeezing the vitality of the laborers. They did not consider the harvest of resources from a long-term perspective at all. They were completely trying to shorten the time possible and quickly plunder and harvest a batch of spiritual mineral resources. In this regard, Aogn and the laborers could not resist at all and could only continue to work according to the rules. Every day, there were laborers who fell down from the heavy work around them. Of course, the forces of the Iron Snake Island knew about this, but they did not care at all. Instead, they increased the workload again. Such an act made Aogn feel mentally and physically exhausted, but the strong vitality in his body allowed him to hold on. In less than a month, more than half of the laborers in the mine died, and the remaining few had completely lost the ability to continue working. Aogn was an exception. Although he also felt extremely tired, he still held on. That feeling was very strange. He clearly felt that he was about to die, but his body would always respond with a strong desire to survive, allowing him to hold on. This force could even affect Aogn's choice. With regard to this force, Aogn could only use 2 words to describe it: to live. Just like in the desert previously, the strong desire to survive made him subconsciously make the decision to live. After the death of most of the laborers, the Iron Snake Island did not replenish the number of new laborers. Instead, they gathered the remaining laborers one day, and the man in green armor appeared in front of them again. At this time, there were less than 10 laborers left. Among them, 9 had collapsed from the heavy work and completely lost consciousness. Only Aogn was still conscious. In fact, Aogn also wanted to pretend to be the same as these 9 people, and did not want to appear too different. However, he could not pretend at all. After being tested, he still gave himself away. However, what surprised Aogn was that what greeted him was not a severe punishment, but a question from the man in green armor. "Kid, you're not bad. Do you want to follow me?" As the man spoke, he reached out and rubbed Aogn's head with a smile on his face. Aogn was speechless. Aogn was speechless. He wanted to refuse, but the words that came out of his mouth were timid. "I want to live. I want to see the sea." Then follow me." Just like that, Aogn followed the man and left the island where he had lived for a few months. As for the resource island, the man obviously did not want to occupy it for a long time. Instead, he decisively abandoned it. Those laborers who had lost their abilities were also abandoned on the island. After getting along for a month, Aogn knew that the man's name was Iron Snake. He had formed a sea-plundering force and wandered around the nearby sea. He developed by plundering resources and even occupied a resource island, which he renamed as Iron Snake Island. The days after that changed. Aogn no longer needed to work day after day in the dark mine cave. Instead, he lived on the Iron Snake Island. He was even called the third son by Iron Snake, and his treatment was greatly improved. Occasionally, he would go out to sea with Iron Snake, wandering and plundering in the sea. Every time they returned from plundering, there would be a carnival in the Iron Snake Island. They would eat meat and drink wine, and the smell of smoke and fire was strong. However, Aogn's favorite was to squat on the coast when he was resting, looking at the direction of the sea, enjoying the sunrise and sunset, and quietly watching the scenery of the sea and sky. Every time this happened, the hoarse voice of the old man and the longing for the sea that appeared in his eyes before his death would unconsciously appear in his mind. In fact, Aogn felt that although he sympathized with the old man, he would not miss him. However, this thought arose spontaneously, and he could not suppress it at all. Aogn's feeling towards the sea seemed to be inherited from the old man's obsession, which was full of yearning. Such days lasted for a period of time. One day, Iron Snake suddenly found Aogn and told him that if he wanted to survive in this world, strength was the foundation and he should grow up. In this regard, Iron Snake gave him a choice. He asked him to find a few deputy captains on the island and choose one to be his master to start his cultivation. Ao Jian did as he was told. There were a total of 3 deputy captains on the island. One was good at controlling the power of elements, one relied on the strong physical body of his race and was good at close combat, and the last one was eccentric but good at using his sword. With such a choice, Ao Jian naturally intended to choose the person who used the sword without hesitation. However, this time, it was still not up to Ao Jian. The moment he chose to start, he was out of control. However, in the end, he still chose the person who used the sword, who was the weakest among the 3. The reason was also very simple. Ao Jian, who was out of control, asked the 3 who was stronger. The answer he got was the strongest one who controlled the power of elements. At the same time, he also got an answer. If they were in the same realm, then the person who used the sword was definitely the strongest. Therefore, Ao Jian made a choice. He wanted the strongest person in the same realm. This choice made Ao Jian even more certain that this was the path that the underworld sword master had taken. In the days that followed, he began his swordsmanship cultivation. As all the knowledge of swordsmanship in his mind was blocked, he could only start from scratch. The first step was to condense the sword heart. Before starting this step, the deputy captain examined Ao Jian's body and came to a conclusion. If he wanted to go further, he had to condense the earth attribute sword heart among the 5 elements. Ao Jian chose to resist this step before he even started. This was because he hated the color yellow. It would remind him of the boundless yellow world filled with sand and wind. To him, that place was more like a prison, filled with all kinds of unhappiness. Therefore, Ao Jian asked the deputy captain if he could choose the blue color, which was the sword essence of the water attribute. The deputy captain fiercely reprimanded Ao Jian and told him that if he took the first wrong step, he would no longer have any potential in the future, unless he took the initiative to shatter the sword essence and sword heart and start from scratch. In this regard, Ao Jian did not insist on anything. Instead, he silently accepted the guidance. The first step was the cultivation of swordsmanship. He had to accompany the long sword every day, observe the shape of the sword, and imprint it into his mind little by little. Ao Jian took this step very steadily. His desire for strength made him cultivate very seriously. This was because Iron Snake had told him that in this world, strength and survival were linked. If he wanted to survive, he had to be strong. Soon, Ao Jian's mind depicted the specific appearance of the long sword. At this time, he began to cast the sword heart under the guidance of the deputy captain. During this period, the deputy captain told him to try to meditate on the scene of yellow sand all over the sky and build a world in his heart that was closely related to the earth. It would be considered a success if he could smell the smell of the earth while meditating. However, when this step was initiated, Ao Jian's heart was full of resistance. He could not calm down to build the sword heart world of the earth attribute at all. Every time this happened, he would come to the seaside, quietly look at the sea, think about his troubles, and be intoxicated by the blue world after countless failures. Ao Jian was very disappointed. Until one day, he made up his mind to try to build a world of the sea. Although the deputy captain had warned him, Ao Jian still chose to go his own way. Different from the yellow world, the blue world was quickly built by him. The long sword in his heart also entered this world at this time. He had condensed the sword heart, but it was not the sword essence of the earth attribute. Instead, it was the water attribute that did not correspond to his own attribute. The moment the deputy captain heard the news, he cursed and beat him up. However, Ao Jian smiled because he liked the blue color and yearned for the sea. It was just that simple. As the deputy captain said, he had chosen the wrong path. His cultivation progress was extremely slow. It took a lot of time to condense the sword essence. The deputy captain also completely gave up teaching Ao Jian, thinking that this child was completely hopeless. However, Ao Jian was very happy. The improvement of his strength every day made him feel as if he was reborn, especially when he displayed the sword essence of the water attribute. The blue sword light that filled his body always made him feel as if he was in the sea. The continuous strengthening of the sword essence made Ao Jian feel as if the water in the pool was constantly increasing. He looked forward to the future when the water would converge into the sea. Such days continued for a long time. Ao Jian gradually grew up and his status also changed. He was no longer just an ordinary member of the island, but an official member of the pirate ship. He began to follow Iron Snake and the deputy captain out to sea to plunder. In fact, Ao Jian did not resist every time they plunder. This was because the idea instilled in him by Iron Snake was that if he wanted to live a better life, he must take what he wanted from the hands of others. The power of Iron Snake Island also grew rapidly in such plunder. It annexed several nearby, small forces, and its members increased day by day. However, some things were destined to change. During one plunder, they encountered the attack of an extremely powerful force from the sea. On that day, Ao Jian saw countless ferocious sea beasts rolling on the sea, knocking over the ships and devouring the crew. Although he was lucky to escape in the end, Iron Snake was seriously injured in this battle. Since no one on the island had medical skills, they would usually choose to exile this seriously injured member in such a situation. They would throw him on the raft and let him drift away, quietly waiting for death to come. However, this time, the most important leader of Iron Snake Island was injured. Everyone panicked, including Ao Jian. They began to try to recover Iron Snake using poor methods. Perhaps because of this, Iron Snake, who could have lived for a while, was injured more seriously and reached the end of his life in advance. At this moment, the power of Iron Snake Island was no longer as cohesive as before. Who would be the leader became the biggest problem. The three deputy captains all wanted to be the leader. At the same time, Iron Snake's eldest and second sons also wanted to inherit the position. However, the members on the island were more inclined to let one of the three deputy captains become the leader. There was no such thing as inheritance rights in this world. Even if there was, it would be those super forces that cast the dynasty. Here, everything depended on strength. Because of their desires, Iron Snake's eldest and second sons were eventually exiled by the members of the island. However, Ao Jian stayed because he had no yearning for the leader's position and there was no conflict of interest. However, even so, the internal dispute of Iron Snake Island did not subside. Instead, it was fragmented. The three deputy captains led their respective supporters and divided Iron Snake Island into three forces. They started to fight for the ownership of the island. It was at that moment that Ao Jian chose to leave. He sat on a raft and drifted in the sea because he did not like power and competition at all. What he wanted to do more was to gather the river in the Sword Heart world into the sea. Ao Jian's enthusiasm for the cultivation of sword intent did not come from his love for the sword, but his desire for blue. It was this desire that made Ao Jian want to continue to cultivate this sword intent. In the following days, he had no fixed residence. He became one of the many wanderers in this sea area. During this period, in order to learn a stronger sword intent, he joined many forces. He also learned many sword intents: Water Spirit Sword, Wave Sword, Ripple Sword, Vast Sea Sword. All the sword intents that he learned were related to the sea. Even though the learning process of each sword intent was extremely difficult, he never gave up and kept improving based on his passion. During this period, there were several time jumps. Every jump point was when he was learning a new sword intent. This also caused Ao Jian to be unable to sense how much time had passed. During this period, he returned to Iron Snake Island once. At this time, the leader of Iron Snake Island had already changed. It was not the three deputy captains that he knew, but an old man with white hair and a doddering appearance. Iron Snake Island was not as strong as it used to be. It seemed to be in the late stage of decay and was approaching the end of its twilight. Ao Jian had no impression of this person. From him, Ao Jian learned that 1,800 years had passed. The old man said that he still remembered Ao Jian Amu because he was the third son of Iron Snake, and he used to be an ordinary member of Iron Snake's subordinate force. The old man told Ao Jian that countless people had died in the years of plundering, and he had grown into a leader step by step in such an environment. In the end, the old man could not help but ask Ao Jian why he had not aged. There was an end to the life of every creature, except for a few creatures with special forms. Only by constantly breaking through the realm could they obtain a stronger vitality. Otherwise, they would eventually step into the 6 realms of reincarnation and start over. At that time, Ao Jian's strength was only at the Ghost Supreme Commander. Although he was far from reaching the end of his life, why did he not age at all? Ao Jian could not answer this question. He was also very puzzled about this. Why did he, who was only at the Ghost Supreme Commander realm, not age at all? He could even feel the strong fluctuation of vitality in his body. Not only did it not decrease with age, it was getting stronger and stronger. Unable to answer this question, Ao Jian finally bid farewell to the old man and once again set foot on the road of cultivation. In the days that followed, Ao Jian searched everywhere for swords. Every time he jumped, Ao Jian would find himself starting a new cultivation journey. Time flew by quickly, but it did not leave any trace on Ao Jian's body. The forces in the nearby sea area changed and massacres happened every day, but Ao Jian never cared about it. Under Ao Jian's cultivation, the blue world and the heart of the sword converged into a river and gradually formed a lake. When he reached the Ghost King realm, he did not know how much time had passed. This was because his cultivation was far slower than others. He only relied on his passion to support others' seemingly boring or even strenuous cultivation of sword will. At this time, Ao Jian had even forgotten whether he was Ao Jian or Mu in the passage of time. It seemed that other than the cultivation of sword will, everything else had slowly faded. Another turning point of fate had also quietly arrived at this time. At that time, Ao Jian had already reached the Ghost Emperor realm. Although he kept a low profile, he was also a very well-known and powerful swordsman in this sea area. This was because he had already become a pioneer in swordsmanship, and there were no more enemies in this sea area. On the road of seeking swords, he had already surpassed all the swordsmen in the sea area. This process was like a tortoise and a rabbit race. Although Ao Jian's cultivation progress was the slowest, he was definitely the most serious. He relied on the accumulated strength to surpass his former teachers or opponents little by little. This was not because Ao Jian's talent was superior. Everything could be summed up with the word hard work. Although other swordsmen were talented and had the corresponding sword heart, they were still bound by the secular world. Some swordsmen longed for power. Some longed for a large number of resources to help them cultivate faster. They were warriors in the world of cruel competition, and there would always be a time when they would stop. However, Ao Jian did not. He focused on cultivating sword will. Although the progress was slow, he did not stop at all. During this period, Ao Jian's strong vitality and unlimited desire for survival had also helped Ao Jian greatly. It gave him the capital to slowly move forward without thinking too much. However, the bottleneck had still arrived. After the Ghost Emperor realm, his strength could not be improved anymore. Even his body began to reject the heart of the sword. This problem could not be solved by Ao Jian with hard work. However, he did not give up and began to look for a solution. During this period, he tried many methods, but none of them produced any effect. The realm seemed to be stuck at the Ghost Emperor realm. Just when Ao Jian was distressed, he met the Acheron Chamber of Commerce. It was a battle of plunder. The largest plunder force in this sea region confronted the Acheron Chamber of Commerce. It was also at that time that Ao Jian met a person. He held a sword with one hand. When he raised his hand, heavy waves surged forward. Countless ships were swallowed up and smashed. Those members of the plunder force who seemed to be invincible in this sea region were so vulnerable in the face of the power of the sea. That sword was deeply imprinted in Ao Jian's mind. At that time, Ao Jian did not know where the courage came from. He flew to that person and wanted to ask for a sword. However, Ao Jian only received a cold word, "Get lost." and the figure disappeared on the spot. However, that person's figure was imprinted in Ao Jian's mind. He swore that he must ask for a sword from that person and master the essence of his sword will, especially the sword that could trigger the power of the sea. In the days to come, Ao Jian's mind would often think of the graceful posture of that sword. Under the guidance of the sword will, the waves that were stacked and pushed forward were always replayed in Ao Jian's mind. Since there was no way to learn it, he would try to comprehend it. In this regard, Ao Jian began to practice hard and began to try. At the same time, he also began to look for that swordsman and explore this person's information. Usually, Ao Jian did not care about the composition of the Sea region forces. However, this time, he was particularly attentive. In the end, he learned that this person was Sword Master, one of the 3 supreme masters of the Acheron Chamber of Commerce. In order to get in touch with this person, the only way was to join the Acheron Chamber of Commerce and go to the Central Sea region of the Acheron. With his strength, it was not difficult to join the Acheron Chamber of Commerce. However, it was still far from being able to settle in the Central Sea region. Even if he went there, he would be at the bottom and would not be able to get in touch with Swordmaster. However, Ao Jian did not give up because he found a way. That was to become a war chamber of commerce. As long as he had enough strength, he would definitely be able to settle in the Central Sea region in the future and become one of the important forces under the headquarters of the Acheron Chamber of Commerce. With this idea, Ao Jian returned to Iron Snake Island. This was the place where he first started to practice. The leader had already changed several times. When he saw that old man again, all that was left of him was his cenotaph. At this time, Iron Snake Island was no longer the all-powerful force in the vicinity. Instead, it was reduced to the lowest level force with a scale of less than 100 people. Ao Jian came here and met the new leader. He explained his intention to create a powerful fleet. Facing Ao Jian, who was in the Ghost Emperor realm, the leader did not hesitate and chose to give his position to Ao Jian. Thus, the Iron Snake fleet was established and began the path of killing. Along the way, blood and death accompanied each other. Ao Jian was seriously injured several times and almost died a few times. However, he still managed to hold on. His body had an endless desire to live, which could always pull him back from the edge of death. His sword intent was also constantly solidified in the killing. His growth and the growth of his forces were like a hurricane in this sea region, sweeping across and constantly plundering and strengthening. However, Ao Jian also had his own principles in plundering. That was to never touch the forces under the protection of the Acheron Chamber of Commerce, because that would be his next step. Finally, one day, when he felt that it was possible, he found the Acheron Chamber of Commerce branch in that sea region and expressed his intention to join it. His request was answered. The Acheron Chamber of Commerce quickly sent people to investigate and test his forces. Ao Jian, who came prepared, finally obtained the title of War Chamber of Commerce. In the days to come, all his efforts were to improve his position in the Acheron Chamber of Commerce and obtain the opportunity to enter the Central Sea region of the Acheron. Time slipped away. Time flew by. Amu's name resounded in the nearby sea region, and he became a powerhouse that no one dared to provoke. His Iron Snake fleet grew into the strongest chamber of commerce among the top 10 war chambers of commerce. During this period, Ao Jian had put in a lot of effort. However, the last step seemed to be close at hand, but it was out of reach. The Central Sea region was the habitat of the powerhouses. Even if he became the #1 war chamber of commerce in the branch, his strength was still far away from that step. His cultivation was getting slower day by day, and he had been stuck in the Ghost Emperor realm for a long time. The subordinates around him had also been replaced several times. They were their descendants, or even the descendants of their descendants. Time had faded his memory, but the descendants still followed him from generation to generation. During this period, he had experienced countless wars, even to the point of challenging the Acheron Chamber of Commerce. However, in the end, he got through them unscathed. Time had changed many things, but it did not change Ao Jian's original intention. In his memory, yellow sand filled the sky. He saw a touch of blue in the old man's eyes. Turbulent waves surged in his eyes, longing to touch it. His trembling hand grasped the air at the last moment of his life, but what he got was still a handful of yellow sand. Ao Jian inherited this obsession. He wanted to cast the sea of sword will in his heart. Even if the road ahead was full of difficulties, he would never give up. The only thing that kept him going was his passion, so he would not feel tired or mentally tired. As time passed, the war would never stop. Another huge challenge was coming. It was a super force that spanned across many seas. This force aimed at the Acheron Chamber of Commerce. There were many powerhouses in the divine realm under their command. They launched attacks with several branches of the Acheron Sea region at the same time and formed a crushing advantage. In front of this force, Ao Jian felt how small he was. It was the first time he fought against an opponent in the demigod realm. In this battle, Ao Jian was seriously injured and his subordinates suffered heavy losses. It was also that battle that made Ao Jian have a breakthrough. At the juncture of life and death, he thought of the sword master. The desire to live unlocked all of Ao Jian's potential. At that moment, he had an epiphany. With a wave of his hand, he mobilized the power of the sea and slashed out the sword that he had practiced countless times in his mind. The sea roared and collapsed, overlapping and moving forward. The infinite sword will locked on the powerhouse in the demigod realm. That touch of blue was amazing. When the blue light faded, the seemingly invincible opponent had fallen. It was also that sword that made Ao Jian break through the demigod realm and gain the opportunity to go to the central sea region of the Acheron. This sword was called the wave-stacking sword by Ao Jian. It was also a key turning point in his life. In the end, the force that faced the Acheron Chamber of Commerce was wiped out after the Acheron headquarters in the central sea region intervened. At that time, Ao Jian also moved into the central sea region in the name of the War Chamber of Commerce. In the end, he met the swordmaster as he wished and became his sword disciple. In the days that followed, under the guidance of the swordmaster, Ao Jian practiced hard. The bottleneck he once faced faded away, and he even became one of the 8 sword envoys under the command of the swordmaster. However, the swordmaster told Ao Jian that his potential was limited after all. He had forged a sword heart that was incompatible with himself. The divine realm was the end, and it was impossible to move forward. At that time, the swordmaster persuaded Ao Jian to reforge his sword heart. It was not too late to change before he condensed the sword principle divine seal. However, Ao Jian did not give up. He knew that he relied on his passion to get to where he was now. If he had chosen the earth attribute sword heart, he would not be where he was now. Although the process was long and the progress was slow, Ao Jian clearly understood what he relied on to get to where he was now. If he started over again, perhaps the progress of his cultivation would be faster because he had a very rich knowledge of sword principle. However, without that passion, he also lost the ambition to forge the sword heart world into the sea. As time went by, in the central sea region where danger lurked everywhere, battles between peak experts often happened. Even the Acheron Chamber of Commerce had to be cautious here. Ao Jian also grew rapidly under such an environment and the supply of resources from the Acheron Chamber of Commerce. Until one day, a bad news came. The swordmaster was killed by an ancient god from the opposing forces at the edge of the 6th Tao of reincarnation due to the fight for resources. The entire Acheron Chamber of Commerce was shocked. It was also at this time that Ao Jian and the other 7 famous swordsmen received an order. One of them must take over the position of the swordmaster. At that time, no one was optimistic about Ao Jian because he was the weakest among the 8 famous swordsmen. Regardless of talent or cultivation progress, he could not be compared to the other 7. Just when Ao Jian was still shocked by the news of the swordmaster's death, he suddenly felt the world shake and then found himself in the sword principle field. Not far away, Sui Yi was staring at him fiercely with eyes full of killing intent. At this moment, memories came one after another, and the memories and the illusion gradually faded. Although he could still remember some of it, It was as if it was covered with a layer of gauze and became blurred. How long has it been? Ao Jian suddenly turned to look at Sui Yi and asked, What do you mean, how long has it been? Why don't you challenge me? Sui Yi said with a look of disdain. Ao Jian. At this moment, Poseidon's sword seal burst forth with a vast power and violently hit Ao Jian. Game notification. Sword will confrontation failed. Damage received. 27562641 points. You have died. Game notification. Obtained 2% rule of sword will. This challenge failed. Please keep up the good work and continue the challenge. Sui Yi, who was not far away, saw that Ao Jian was killed by the rule of sword will. He was stunned at first, but then he smiled happily. It was good that he was dead. It was good that he was dead. Chapter 698. It was only a few seconds, but it felt like a very long time. As Ao Jian woke up from a state of sword will struggle, the illusion was broken and the long memory in his mind faded away. Ao Jian was very confused about this and could not remember what he had encountered in the illusion. Lu Wu, who saw this scene, nodded his head in satisfaction. It was because he was the one who manipulated everything behind the scenes. This was the sword seal of the underworld swordsman, which was condensed by the water sword will that he had learned all his life. It still contained the consciousness of the underworld swordsman and had not completely dissipated. In fact, Ao Jian's guess was right. This illusion allowed Ao Jian to relive the memory of the underworld swordsman. The difference was that except for a few important turning points, all the decisions were made by Ao Jian. If Ao Jian finished the memory of the underworld swordsman, then this memory would remain in Ao Jian's mind. Although he was still Ao Jian at that time, he would recognize himself as the underworld swordsman. This was because the memory of the underworld swordsman was not as simple as Ao Jian had thought. Although Ao Jian's original memory would not be erased after going through the memory of the underworld swordsman, there was no meaning for his existence, which was equivalent to nothing. Ao Jian had lived for as long as the underworld swordsman had lived. Compared to the memory of the underworld swordsman, Ao Jian's memory was like a drop in the ocean, not worth mentioning at all. This was because Ao Jian's memory was only a few decades old. In contrast, the memory of the underworld swordsman was like a vast ocean. The memory droplets that dripped into it would inevitably be engulfed and covered. When Ao Jian had lived in the illusion for millions of years, the first few decades would become inconspicuous, like dust in the corner, and he would not even think about it. Therefore, Ao Jian gradually forgot who he was in the illusion. He only remembered that he was pursuing the ocean of sword will and thought that he was Amu. When he first entered the illusion, Ao Jian might still have doubts and speculations. However, with the passage of time and the accumulation of experience, coupled with the passage of time, he had long forgotten who he was in the past. This was because that memory was too short. It could even be described as insignificant. This was also the reason why Lu Wu chose to take action. It could be said that Ao Jian's memory had been completely overwritten by the memory of the underworld swordsman before he exited the illusion of the sword will competition. Although the real underworld swordsman had died, Ao Jian would be the new underworld swordsman because they had the same memories. Although this was not the resurrection of the underworld swordsman, it was equivalent to a clone. It had the same memories, the same sword will, the same mental journey, and so on. Even though the real underworld swordsman was dead, Ao Jian was no longer Ao Jian. Naturally, Lu would not sit idly by and do nothing about it. He took decisive measures. Therefore, when Ao Jian withdrew from the illusion of sword will competition, the long memory and experience in his mind would gradually fade and be covered, and he could no longer remember what it was. The purpose of this was to protect Ao Jian so that he would not lose himself. Of course, Lu Wu was still looking forward to Ao Jian defeating and obtaining the law of sword will. After all, his heavenly demon list was currently collecting the power of laws, so this rule sword intent could be used. Moreover, as a player, Ao Jian had the ability to resurrect infinitely. Moreover, Lu Wu was helping him conceal his memory behind the scenes, so this method was completely feasible. It was just that he might have to work harder. 3 hours later, Ao Jian's figure appeared at the resurrection point in the mansion of the dead. This time he did not stop at all. He decisively walked to the city gate, arrived at the Liuli coast through the teleportation point, and then set off for the Kendo domain. The sudden failure and death stunned Ao Jian, but the 2% mastery of the Law of Sword made him feel excited. He only remembered that he had entered a dreamland after the sword competition of Poseidon's sword seal was activated. The memory after that was a blur. It seemed that he had experienced many things and met many people, but he could not remember the specific matters no matter how hard he tried. When he suddenly woke up, everything faded, but the sword will that he had mastered in the dreamland remained in his heart of the sword. Therefore, Ao Jian wanted to go to the Kendo domain again to challenge Poseidon's sword will. He wanted to see what was in the dreamland and why his heart of the sword and sword will had such a huge change. After a few days of sailing, Ao Jian once again stepped into the Kendo domain. At this time, the Kendo domain was full of competition as usual. Swordsmen and players were everywhere, as the bald mentor could not be found, and it was extremely difficult to enter the central area of the Kendo domain. The players turned their attention to the other swordsmen who had stepped into the Kendo domain. This time, it was not Suiye who was devastated. The other swordsmen were also challenged by the players, and became the players' whetstone for the growth of their sword will. Ao Jian did not pay too much attention to this, and steered the boat all the way into the Kendo domain. During the few days of sailing, Ao Jian had experienced 7 challenges. However, during the sword will competition, Ao Jian found that his sword was attached with a water attribute power, and his sword will had undergone a qualitative change. Compared to when he had mastered Relentless Sword, the strength of his sword will had increased by 10 times. He had also become proficient in the use of sword will and the release of sword chi, as if his heart of the sword had been reborn. Without exception, he had won all 7 challenges. It was not like before, where he won the final victory by constantly recasting his sword will. Such a discovery made Ao Jian happy, and he was even more eager to know what he had experienced in the illusion of the sword will competition. With yearning, Ao Jian once again arrived at the central point of the Kendo domain. Not far away, the golden figure transformed by the sea god sword seal was still standing on the surface of the water, and Suiye was sitting cross-legged not far away from him. Suiye suddenly opened his eyes when he felt an aura approaching. When he saw the familiar figure of Ao Jian, Suiye's face was filled with disbelief as if he had seen a ghost. "How have you been?" Ao Jian greeted him with a smile. "You? How is this possible? The sea god sword seal killed you. How did you do it?" Suiye asked in horror. "Do you want to learn? Let me teach you." Ao Jian teased. "Suiye, yes." This time, Suiye said without hesitation. Previously, Suiye could think that he had been careless and did not completely kill Ao Jian. When the rule came later and deprived the sword will, Suiye also thought that the rule of sword will had probed wrongly. Because other than this explanation, Suiye could not find a suitable reason to explain that Ao Jian could be resurrected after his death. However, this time, Ao Jian, who had been smashed by the sea god sword seal, was resurrected again. Obviously, the reason that he had previously thought of could no longer be explained. At this moment, Suiye's heart was in turmoil. Therefore, when Ao Jian asked with a teasing look, "Do you want to learn?" Suiye said without hesitation, "Yes." Ao Jian was speechless. Looking at Suiye's serious face, the corner of Ao Jian's mouth twitched. He was joking, but it seemed that Suiye was serious. This made Ao Jian a little embarrassed, and he tried to change the topic. "How's your challenge going?" Suiye shook his head with a sigh. "My sword will can't compete with this rule of sword will unless I get the recognition of the consciousness left in the sea god sword seal. Otherwise, I can't compete with sword will to succeed in the challenge. However, as long as I absorb all the sword will in the sword principle field, I will definitely be able to fight with it." Looking at Suiye's determined expression, Ao Jian asked in confusion, Then why are you staying here instead of collecting sword will? Didn't I tell you? There is more than one way. You can also get the rule of sword will by getting the recognition of the sword seal. Suiya rolled his eyes. Suiya was no longer as cold to Ao Jian as before. This was because Ao Jian's invincible sword will had gained his recognition. Just like what he said before, if they were outside the field, he would definitely take Ao Jian in as a sword disciple and let him train with him. Moreover, Ao Jian had saved his life once, which Sui Yi remembered. However, he only remembered it in his heart and had a good impression of Ao Jian. As for the rule of sword will, Sui Yi would never give in. If he could, he would rather Ao Jian die. Have you been chatting with the consciousness left in the sword seal for the past few days to get close to it? Ao Jian had a strange look on his face. Sui Yi was speechless. Ao Jian's words seemed to have hit Siye's sore spot, and his face gradually turned gloomy. Then continue with your work? I'll try again. As soon as he finished speaking, Ao Jian walked towards the golden figure again. Sui Yi did not stop him, but chose to watch from the side. Even if he was resurrected again, Sui Yi still did not think that Ao Jian could defeat the rule of sword will, and he was looking forward to Ao Jian being crushed by the sea god sword will again. He did not believe that the heaven-defying resurrection ability could be repeated infinitely. Once again, Ao Jian came to the front of the sea god's sword seal incarnation. With anticipation, he gathered his sword will and challenged it. At this moment, the world in front of him began to collapse and reconstruct. When his vision became clear, he found himself in a world of yellow sand. At the same time, the memories that were sealed by Lu Wu in his mind came flooding back. Ao Jian suddenly came to a realization and understood what he had experienced in the illusion last time. This time, everything started over again. At this moment, Ao Jian suddenly understood the ultimate purpose of this illusion challenge. In a battle of sword will, naturally, it was a competition of the strength of the sword will. He walked the memory path of the underworld sword lord, so if he wanted to defeat him, he must surpass him, instead of following the footsteps of his memory and passively accepting things. The last illusory realm challenge ended after the death of the previous underworld merchant guild's sword venerable. At that time, one of the 8 sword envoys had to be selected to inherit the position of sword lord. At that time, Ao Jian was the weakest among the 8 sword envoys, and in the decision of the Underworld Chamber of Commerce, Ao Jian was excluded from the list of candidates for the position of sword lord. It was also at that time that the illusion collapsed. At this moment, Ao Jian believed that it was because he did not obtain the position of sword lord. At that time, he did not reach the strength and status of sword lord. The 8 sword envoys were his limit, so he was determined to fail the challenge by the rule of sword will. Therefore, if he wanted to win in this sword will battle, he not only had to walk the memory path of the underworld sword lord, but he also had to surpass him and prove that his sword will was better than that of the underworld sword lord. After understanding the reason, Ao Jian looked up at his surroundings. The sky was filled with yellow sand, and he squinted his eyes. Just like what he had experienced before, he suddenly felt thirsty, dizzy, and weak. However, a strong desire to survive burst forth in his body, so he did not collapse. However, he knew that it would not be long before an old man came to rescue him. At this moment, Ao Jian was like a cheat that could predict the future. Under normal circumstances, if one failed in the sword will battle, the challenger would definitely be killed by Neptune's sword will. Therefore, every challenger experienced the illusion path from the beginning. There is no advantage that they could take advantage of, and they did not know what would happen in the future. Even the sword will that they learned would be blocked by the rule of sword will, so they could only comprehend it from the beginning. However, Ao Jian was different. For him, death was only 3 hours away. Once again entering the illusion, the memories that he had experienced came back. At this time, Ao Jian had completely understood the subsequent development of the plot. Just as he thought, about half an hour later, the figure of an old man holding a plant vine appeared in the distance. He passed through the sandstorm and slowly approached him. A new plot had begun. The figure was as thin as a stick, and his steps were unsteady. However, the firmness in his eyes made Ao Jian's heart tremble. This feeling was familiar yet strange. The old man seemed inconspicuous, but his desire for the sea had affected him, or rather, the life of the underworld sword lord. A new journey had begun again. This time, Ao Jian was no longer passively receiving help. The last time he came, he had been watching the whole process with cold eyes. He had been guessing the reason for the illusion and analyzing all kinds of possibilities. However, this time, he did not intend to sit still and wait for death. Along the way, he and the old man supported each other and moved forward together. Although there was no communication, they had used their lives to ensure that the other would survive. Along the way, they ate and slept in the open. All the plants and small animals that could be seen became their food. In the previous illusion, the old man had exhausted his strength in order to help Ao Jian. However, this time was obviously different from before. Because Ao Jian was no longer a burden, he tried his best to reduce the old man's burden and struggled to survive. After more than 10 days of rushing, Ao Jian and the old man were on the verge of death several times, but they finally survived. This time, the plot was completely different from before. After he and the old man climbed over the hillside, they saw the blue sea together. The breeze blew gently, and the sound of the waves hitting the reef and the sound of the seagulls above the sea intoxicated the two. This time, the memory did not jump with the death of the old man. Finally, they had reached this place together. Ao Jian turned his head to look at the old man who was staring at the direction of the sea. A smile appeared on his face. At least this time, he did not have the biggest regret of this illusion challenge. As for the success or failure of the later journey, he would continue. Chapter 699. As a veteran player of Battle Royale, Ao Jian had always been grateful to the game. That was why he never conspired with other players in the forum and called the Battle Royale officials a dog. The worst time was when he did not join the Acheron Chamber of Commerce in advance, but took the lead in competing with the 8 sword envoys in terms of lifespan. Subsequently, in order to better overcome the illusory challenge, Ao Jian even recorded all the important time points in his memory. Dog officials, what kind of rubbish plot is this? My liver hurts. However, he had no impression of the encounter in the 2 challenges. It was not easy to do so, although the underworld swordsman was also average in talent, relying on his strong vitality and the ambition to build the sea of sword heart to support his long cultivation journey. While waiting and growing, the underworld swordsman died as expected. However, in the face of the sword will of the law, Ao Jian could only say, "How delicious," and continue to work hard. The ability to predict the future, which was his biggest advantage, would no longer exist. What was different from the previous time was that Ao Jian obtained a place in the quota for the promotion to the Underworld Swordsman and received the support of many senior members of the Acheron Chamber of Commerce. This time, Ao Jian became the leader of Iron Snake Island in advance and began to lead the rise of Iron Snake Island. The difference was that there was one more person on Iron Snake Island. It was the old man who entered the sea with him. Ao Jian's idea was very simple. He adopted this group of wall-hanging children in advance, and then instilled an idea into them. Although his talent was average, Ao Jian felt that he had a huge advantage in terms of lifespan. In the future, you must help your father to become a sword master, otherwise you will be unfilial. Your father is the most important person in the world. Being in the illusory world, Ao Jian set a goal for himself. The time for Ao Jian to work hard had arrived. Ao Jian even adopted a group of children in the Illusory Realm Challenge this time. For example, Ao Jian originally wanted to give up building the Sea of Sword Heart and wanted to cultivate other sword wills. Perhaps the Underworld Swordsman did not expect that someone could play like this in the law of the illusory world and did not play according to his plan at all. Therefore, there was no notification of the illusory world breaking and the sword will battle failing this time. The plot was still moving forward. In this regard, Ao Jian had his own speculation. However, all these were not worth mentioning as compared to Ao Jian's determination. Apart from the old man's continued existence, nothing else changed. He became one of the 8 sword envoys under Venerable Sword. Compared to the first time Ao Jian entered the Dreamland, he was much stronger now. It was not hopeless. Although time had skipped, the old man had not died. Instead, he had followed him to this place. In other words, the initial change in the plot had also changed the subsequent history. It had not been erased with a time jump. What Ao Jian had to do next was to face challenges and be challenged. He had to work hard to fight for the position of Swordmaster. This group of children had extraordinary potential, all of them making a name for themselves in the future, even using their own abilities to settle in the Central Sea region of Yellow Spring. This was also the end of his previous illusion. In order to make himself stronger, Ao Jian used all the tricks except for the main plot that could not be changed. Damn it, this is too cruel. However, there was one thing that Ao Jian could not change, and that was some key points in history. Because this body's unique characteristic was its exuberant vitality, he planned to drag them out and then join the Underworld Chamber of Commerce, waiting for the next fight for the position of honorable swordsman to obtain more opportunities for development. In fact, Ao Jian was also dumbfounded because he had once again forgotten what he had experienced. He only felt that he had become stronger. As for the growth of sword will, with so many cheating sons, Ao Jian felt that he could just lie down and take resources to cultivate. Ao Jian's speculation was gradually confirmed in the future. At the same time, Ao Jian had once again comprehended 2% of the rule of sword will. That was, he had to take the same path as the Underworld Swordmaster. The main plot could not be changed, but the side could be changed. However, 3 hours later, he was dumbfounded again. The moment he returned to the field of swordsmanship, Ao Jian was unsurprisingly killed by Poseidon's sword while on the spot. As long as it was a way to obtain a large number of resources and improve his strength, he would try it one by one. Sword will spiritual stones, incomplete sword steels left by ancient gods, peerless swords, etc. Ao Jian did not waste this ability. In the name of helping various forces to deduce the future, he earned a large amount of resources to develop his own forces. When there was no gaming chamber, playing games for more than 8 hours consecutively could be called playing hard. Playing games for more than 16 hours consecutively was called playing hard. At the moment of failure, the illusion was broken and the challenge fail notification appeared again. Apart from the necessary historical key points, Ao Jian could make all the other decisions by himself. Since he knew the development of this period of history, Ao Jian could always be one step ahead of others. He planned to cultivate and advance the superpower house that would be born in this sea area in the future and settle everything for himself. If he could not become the Swordmaster, then the challenge would fail again and he would have to start all over again. However, this time, Ao Jian's mentality was not as careless as when he first entered the illusion. He began to actively look for ways to become stronger instead of passively waiting for the moment to change his fate. For example, what kind of rare treasures would appear in a certain year, month, and place, what its specific function was, and how much help it would be to him. However, the consequence of doing so was a time jump. He appeared directly at the moment when he first cultivated sword will. He obtained a large number of resources to assist his cultivation and spent a huge price to forge a sword that matched his sword heart to improve his strength. Liver pain is liver pain, but I will definitely pass this stage. Therefore, with doubts in his heart, Ao Jian once again stepped into the field of swordsmanship and continued to challenge the law of sword will. After all, Ao Jian had lived in more lives than others. He felt that even if he was a pig, he would still be able to pass this plot. During one of the challenges in the illusion, he was even called the divine foreteller by the forces in the nearby sea area because he could always predict the future and predict things like a god. However, it turned out that Ao Jian was still inferior to the sword users in terms of talent and the strength of sword will. Although only a few seconds had passed in reality, in the spiritual world, Ao Jian had experienced the path that the underworld swordsman had once walked over and over again. These records were the cheats that Ao Jian opened in this illusion, which were very effective. However, at this moment, he could not help but curse. However, when he entered the illusion and the memories of the previous few challenges came flooding in, Ao Jian almost shut himself up. However, Ao Jian would not know anything about the future course of history. Sui Yi, who witnessed all of this, had a natural smile on his face. With the future prediction hack, Ao Jian began to deploy future plans in advance by relying on the memories in his mind. In the subsequent challenges, he was defeated consecutively. After his sword was thwarted, he was finally disqualified from being promoted to the Swordmaster. However, in the face of many things, the choices made by Ao Jian and the Underworld Swordmaster were different, which would inevitably affect the future development. At this moment, Ao Jian was like a protagonist who had activated the template. Your sons, I want them all. Everything was as he thought. Ao Jian could not bear the power of the law of sword will. After countless repetitive challenges, Ao Jian knew the future development of the plot like the back of his hand. That was to walk the same path as the Underworld Swordmaster, but to surpass him in sword will. Ao Jian did not feel that it was a big deal before the challenge. However, with the popularity of the gaming pods, the definition of hard work had also changed. At this stage, only players who stayed in the gaming pods for a month without going offline were called hard work players. Ao Jian tried all the ways that he could think of. For example, at a certain point in time, there would be an inheritance that would be beneficial to his cultivation of sword will, and so on. In the subsequent training, Ao Jian waited for the sudden death of the Underworld Swordmaster and then competed with the other 7 sword users for the position of the Swordmaster. Chapter 700. At this moment, a son who had just finished reporting his recent achievements suddenly looked at Ao Jian with a solemn expression and said, "It's like this, Dad. In fact, in addition to the inherent resources, there is another very important thing that limits our development, which is the constraints of the Underworld Chamber of Commerce. Their trade rules are too overbearing. All our trading activities with the Outer Sea must pay taxes. This practice of the Underworld Chamber of Commerce really makes my brothers and I feel aggrieved. I want to challenge the Underworld Chamber of Commerce, overthrow their rule, and replace them." Such a large amount of resources made Ao Jian smile from ear to ear. However, the development of the branch would not be affected. For example, the acquisition of resources was just like the experience and soul coins during growth, which could help him grow faster and had nothing to do with the main plot. The change of the main plot would lead to a time jump, which Ao Jian remembered in his heart. It was fine no matter how chaotic the branch was, but once the main plot was changed, it would inevitably be pulled back to the right time. In fact, the Sons of the Wall had privately mentioned the establishment of the Sea Realm dynasty to him, but Ao Jian rejected them as it was not the right time. "Dad, my brothers are here today. I want to discuss something with you." The Iron Snake Island force was already a powerful force that could establish a dynasty. It was even stronger than the Underworld Division. However, it would not be the case this time, because they had all become his adopted sons. With the help of the divine spiritual materials, the progress of his sword would be faster. At the same time, these sons would have a new direction to fight in. Fortunately, Ao Jian's brainwashing from a young age was very effective. He was still loyal to Ao Jian and carried out the words that Ao Jian always said. "It wasn't a waste of my efforts to bring you guys up." In their opinion, Ao Jian could completely establish himself as a king and have a broader future. Why should he be subservient and become someone else's subordinate? This time, Ao Jian's actions made him rise rapidly in a short period of time. In Ao Jian's memory, nearly 1/5 of them had successfully entered the Central Sea of the Underworld and became a part of the Central Sea hegemony. As for the 8 sword envoys who might be his father's competitors, these Sons of the Wall had already secretly discussed with Ao Jian behind his back. Countless members of the Sea Realm forces came to celebrate his birthday. At the same time, his Sons of the Wall had also come from the outside world and brought Ao Jian's favorite sword cultivation resources as a birthday gift. Many forces thought that Ao Jian's behavior of accepting sons everywhere was due to Ao Jian's character. It was a kind of eccentricity rather than any special purpose. After some contemplation, Ao Jian made a decision. At the beginning of the birthday banquet, the Sons of the Wall were reporting their recent achievements to Ao Jian. Ao Jian listened with a smile and nodded with satisfaction from time to time. When Ao Jian advanced to the late-stage Ghost Emperor realm, 8 of his sons had already advanced to the demigod realm. Each of the 32 armies under his command had made a name for themselves in the nearby sea area. I feel that with the current scale of our Iron Snake Islands forces, we can totally establish a sea realm empire. Only in this way can we speed up our development. What does Dad think? After experiencing so much, Ao Jian naturally knew what his sons were thinking. In the long development that followed, Ao Jian's power rose rapidly. What? Chapter 701. However, no one knew Ao Jian's secret. Therefore, Ao Jian's success started the era of fatherhood competition in the nearby sea area. The remaining 7 sword envoys chose to abstain and gave up fighting for the position of sword master. However, what Ao Jian did not know was that his adopted sons were rushing to the Netherworld headquarters from all directions in the Central Sea area. In the confrontation and competition, it was inevitable to encounter opponents that were difficult to match, and there would inevitably be unavoidable crises. However, the reality was that not only did Ao Jian not do so, he also chose to join the Netherworld Chamber of Commerce. This was undoubtedly unexpected for many sea area forces who were trying to figure out the future development direction of the Iron Snake Island. Other than the occasional visit from his adopted sons, Ao Jian even shut himself in. He would also think of the smiles on the faces of his deceased sons on his birthday, as well as the congratulatory words they said to him during the birthday banquet. Ao Jian did not have the strength to fight against them at all. After knowing the news, although they did not receive any notice from Ao Jian, they all started to rush to the Netherworld headquarters. Ao Jian. Therefore, Ao Jian's status in the Netherworld Chamber of Commerce became very special because of his adopted sons. It could be said that most of Ao Jian's children had the potential to settle in the Central Sea area of the Netherworld. They originally had great potential to build their own dynasty, and their adopted sons were all like dragons with infinite potential. They would definitely have a bright future. A young Baldy held his mother's hand and came to the Netherworld headquarters. After being examined, he successfully joined the Netherworld headquarters. This was because the other 7 sword envoys had higher talent and strength than him, and 5 of them had even broken through to the divine realm. At this time, Ao Jian's strength was close to the edge of the divine realm. It could be said that he was at the peak of his strength after several challenges in the illusory realm. However, in the face of this battle, he was still not confident. However, the forces in the Central Sea area were not affected by the heavenly phenomenon of breaking through to the divine realm. This was because the competition for the title of Sword Master could not be decided in a short period of time. During this period, they would have to go through several challenges, and the interval between each challenge was relatively long. They entered the various departments of the Netherworld Chamber of Commerce and began their own path of growth from the bottom. These sword-intense spiritual stones were not formed by the heavens and earth. Moreover, they were already used to the heavenly phenomenon of breaking through to the divine realm. When Ao Jian consolidated his realm, the moment he came out of seclusion, he was dumbfounded to receive a piece of news. However, the Acheron Chamber of Commerce was about to usher in a revolution because of Ao Jian's breakthrough. After all, his talent was limited. Aside from his vigorous vitality, he had nothing else. It would be rather difficult for him to win the final challenge. Ao Jian also knew the reason, but he had forgotten which day it happened. They were well aware of their father's strength. Compared to the other 7 sword envoys, there was still a huge gap. If he didn't act now, he would be an unfilial son. When they received the news, the members of the forces in the nearby sea area could not help but sigh in their hearts. They felt that Ao Jian had made a terrible move this time. In fact, it was just as Ao Jian had thought. During the period of Ao Jian's closed-door training, his adopted sons began to secretly coerce and bribe him in order to fulfill their father's wish. Although there were many super geniuses in the Central Sea who could fight beyond their level, Ao Jian knew that he was definitely not one of them. Fortunately, he still had time. However, Ao Jian, who was in seclusion, was unaware of all this after officially settling in the Central Sea region of the Netherworld. Ao Jian became the disciple of the Sword Venerable of the Netherworld according to the plot and became one of the 8 sword envoys. At this moment, Ao Jian was dumbfounded. He had never thought that the situation would change so drastically. There were less than a third of the nearly 200 adopted sons that he had brought with him when he first came to the Central Sea region. However, at the moment when Ao Jian broke through to the divine realm, the persistence in their hearts was broken. After that, they took the initiative to find Ao Jian's adopted sons to express their goodwill, expressing that they were willing to give up the competition. Today, although these adopted sons had not yet stepped into the highest position in the headquarters of the Netherworld, they were different from the past. They had already become the leaders of the various branches in the Central Sea region. In order to suppress this feeling in his heart, Ao Jian devoted himself to the cultivation of sword will and no longer cared about anything in the outside world. Time flew, and 3 years had passed in the blink of an eye. On this day, the shadow of the sea god appeared, and Ao Jian's name was successfully engraved on the underworld god list. This was because there were many good seedlings among Ao Jian's adopted sons who could break through to the ancient god realm. In comparison, it was clear at a glance which side was more beneficial. It was impossible for the higher-ups of the Netherworld Chamber of Commerce not to know about this, but they chose to turn a blind eye to it. The success learning that Ao Jian had left to this sea region was destined to have a far-reaching impact. The sword venerable of the Netherworld had fallen. Moreover, Ao Jian, who was only in the Ghost Emperor realm, was not worth mentioning in the Central Sea region and could not complete any high-intensity tasks. In other words, all the 8 sword envoys had chosen to give up except for Ao Jian. The long period of time together had made him feel attached to them because everything was too real. In this regard, Ao Jian immediately thought of his adopted sons and felt that they must have done something. Therefore, they naturally thought that their father was going to be bullied. However, when he came out of seclusion, he heard a lot of bad news. However, the reason why he could be so special was because of his adopted sons who were full of potential. It was their outstanding performance that supported Ao Jian's current special status. Relying on the countless swordwell resources collected by his adopted sons, Ao Jian spent a whole 6 months to forcibly break through to the divine realm. However, Ao Jian still suppressed the sadness in his heart and transferred all his energy to cultivation. Ao Jian's method of success had also become an example for the members of the forces in the nearby sea region to learn from. This was because no one could predict that the adopted children would have a great future. Realizing that the hurdle had arrived, Ao Jian no longer held back and took out all the swordwell cultivation resources given by his adopted sons, the most precious swordwell spiritual stones. However, this time, the news of the Sword Venerable's sudden death was really unexpected. In the last few challenges in the illusory realm, Ao Jian had always been stuck at this hurdle and could not break through. Of course, there were also some who succeeded and obtained part of the power in the Netherworld Chamber of Commerce and walked to a higher stage. However, they did not expect that in the end. They chose to live under someone else's roof. The Netherworld Chamber of Commerce did not keep idle people. But Ao Jian was an exception. He did not need to be distracted to accept the tasks assigned by the higher-ups of the Netherworld. Because he raised these adopted sons, he could be said to be extremely familiar with each and every one of them. This kind of life day after day, Ao Jian devoted himself to cultivation and no longer cared about worldly affairs. At this moment, the plot also began to move forward. As one of the 8 sword envoys, Ao Jian was about to face a challenge. More importantly, Ao Jian had already broken through to the divine realm. Even if his potential was weak, he could be cultivated. Therefore, they felt very helpless deep down in their hearts when their father had such an idea. After passing this hurdle, the next hurdle would be the bottleneck of the ancient god realm. This probability was very small. Even if one adopted hundreds of thousands of people, there might not be such a proud son. This time, the ambition in the hearts of the energetic adopted sons was finally put to use. Just like that, 1,000 years passed in the blink of an eye. Even if Ao Jian's adopted sons were talented, more than half of them were killed or injured in the continuous years of war. Although the Netherworld Chamber of Commerce did not amount to much in the Central Sea region, a superpower like the Netherworld Chamber of Commerce placed more importance on their future potential, not on the present. After all the forces of the Iron Snake Island moved away, a new journey in this sea area began. This was a magnificent era of fighting. Whoever son was powerful could obtain the most precious treasures and the most resources. This time, Ao Jian was highly valued by the higher-ups of the Netherworld headquarters. This time, Ao Jian took out all of them just to break through to the divine realm. However, they did not dare to say it or advise in desperation. In order to avoid being remembered by others, they decisively bypassed Ao Jian when choosing their first opponent. However, what the higher-ups valued was not Ao Jian's personal ability, but his adopted sons with unlimited potential. They knew very well what this meant. It meant that one of the 8 swordsmen would become the new Sword Venerable and would receive the Netherworld headquarters' vigorous training. They would use all kinds of divine spiritual materials to help the new Sword Venerable break through to the divine realm and become an ancient god. In other words, he had completed the hurdle to become the Sword Venerable in the main plot. How could they not know about such a major event like the death of the Sword Venerable? However, in the face of the desire to become the Sword Venerable, they originally planned to grit their teeth and persevere. For this reason, they even took out their own wealth to buy people's hearts. However, the dead could not be resurrected, which left a sadness in Ao Jian's heart. Although they always thought that it was too difficult for their father to become the Sword Venerable with his talent. And that little bald head was Suya, who was known as the Bald Mentor by the players. Having received the notice from the Netherworld headquarters, Ao Jian finally led the Iron Snake Island forces to officially settle in the Central Sea area and became the Iron Snake Army under the Netherworld headquarters. They were responsible for guarding the resource islands and guarding the resource slaves. In the first year of settling in the headquarters, 3 of Ao Jian's adopted sons broke through to the divine realm. In the following years, more than 10 of them broke through to the divine realm one after another. Their future was limitless. The divine realm was a powerhouse in the outer sea area, but in the central sea area, they could not even determine the outcome of an ordinary battle for resources. Their value was limited. At this time, he was more concerned about the improvement of his strength and sword will. During the days of closed-door cultivation, Ao Jian finally broke through to the demigod realm. Ao Jian knew that his cultivation time was far from over. Therefore, Ao Jian became the new Underworld Sword Venerable and received the support of a large number of divine spiritual materials from the Netherworld headquarters. The reason was very simple. Such potential had really shocked everyone in the Netherworld headquarters. The world was big, but his father's biggest idea had been deeply rooted in his mind since he was young. Even now, it had not weakened at all. As the news spread, the entire Underworld Chamber of Commerce was shocked. However, before Ao Jian could break through to the divine realm, a new piece of news appeared. Ao Jian still walked out of closed-door cultivation. There were even 2 people who chose to give up directly, as they were really shocked by the power of the adopted sons. At this time, Ao Jian was also ready to officially settle in the Central Sea area of the Netherworld. In the end, he once again stepped into closed-door cultivation and began to break through to the divine realm. He did not want to hear such news again, and even hoped to end the illusory realm challenge as soon as possible and leave this world. He led a large number of leaders to follow the trend and began to adopt children, wanting to replicate his legend. Ao did not restrict the development of his adopted sons. He took the initiative to ask them to choose their favorite external department of the Underworld Chamber of Commerce and join it. From the initial Iron Snake Island force, it rapidly developed into the Overlord-level force of the sea area. The rise of Ao became a legend in the nearby sea area. In the first few illusory realm challenges of Ao, the seven sword envoys all chose the soft persimmon Ao as their first challenge target and won the first sentence. Their arrival immediately alerted the other seven sword envoys, except for Ao. As for the cultivation resources of Sword Will, Ao never lacked. When the adopted sons came to visit him, they would always bring a large number of resources to assist in the cultivation of sword, because they knew that their respected father liked this. Although his initial idea was to use these children to achieve his own goals, Ao still had feelings for them after accompanying them for a long time. In order not to offend these leaders with great potential, the seven sword envoys who participated in the competition for the sword venerable, like Ao, were filled with helplessness. Time flew, and the years flew by. However, every time there was bad news, Ao would still think of the days outside the Central Sea area. Because they were only in the divine realm, although they were valuable, that was all. This time, they went to the headquarters aggressively. Even if they were not allowed to fight according to the rules, they were ready to help their father. During the days in the Underworld Chamber of Commerce, Ao often heard the news of the adopted sons dying in the battle for hegemony in the Central Sea area. He also often heard the happy news of a certain adopted son making outstanding achievements for the Underworld Chamber of Commerce. Time flew, and tens of thousands of years passed in the blink of an eye. At this time, Ao met an acquaintance. Even if they were talented and had unlimited potential, all the creatures in the Central Sea area were the same. The cruel competition was always accompanied by death, and they were no exception. They had heard of the rapid rise and powerful potential of the leaders, so they really did not want to offend them. Naturally, Ao did not care about the criticism from the outside world. At this moment, Ao's heart had aged a lot. Even if he was used to seeing life and death, he could not hold back the throbbing in his heart. At this moment, Ao once again relied on his adopted sons to successfully rise to the top. Therefore, he had to seize the time and use the current resources and time as much as possible to improve his strength. Ao had long been prepared for this. On the same day, he set up the Sword Spirit formation near the island where he lived and prepared to break through. In short, Daddy can bully others, but whoever dares to hurt Daddy can just wait for death. In fact, with the current development momentum of Ao's subordinate forces, all the forces thought that Ao would eventually become a super force in the sea area and harvest a lot of resources. When he was strong enough, he would settle in the Central Sea area of the underworld. Although Ao knew that all this was fake, he still felt a sense of vicissitudes. Moreover, the Underworld Sword Venerable was at his peak. No one knew how long he could live. Maybe the Underworld Sword Venerable would still be alive when they were all dead. Moreover, they knew very well that his father's dream was to become the Sword Venerable. Instead, it was transformed from the sword will of those powerful swordsmen after they died. Moreover, it was not inevitable. It also required a certain time and place, which was of great help to the cultivation of sword will. However, it was obvious that without the ability to predict the future, Ao's legend in this sea area could not be replicated. Therefore, Ao could not help but feel sad whenever he heard that his son had died. However, this time, the seven sword envoys were shocked. Since the island where Ao was located was inside the underworld headquarters, he was not worried that someone would come and make trouble. Therefore, he did not inform his adopted sons about this. Moreover, with the current development trend of Ao's force, he did not even need to settle in the Central Sea area in the name of the Underworld Chamber of Commerce. He could completely rely on the scale of his own force to enter the Central Sea area for resource plundering. As time went by, Ao's sword will also strengthen day by day. Chapter 702. On this day, a mother and son arrived at the underworld headquarters at the Central Sea region. On the day of her arrival, the woman submitted an application to the Underworld Merchant Guild to join them. The Underworld Merchant Guild did not immediately agree to the woman's application, even though she was already at the peak of godly state. As a superpower, the Underworld Merchant Guild had its own vetting system for accepting members. They would not easily accept outsiders who wanted to join them. Under normal circumstances, other than the members trained by the Underworld headquarters at the Central Sea region, most of the members who joined the headquarters were selected from the War Merchant Guild of the Underworld branches. It could be said that they knew everything about her, and it was impossible for her to be a spy sent by a hostile organization. Even when A.O. Jian entered the Central Sea region in the name of the War Merchant Guild, he was also vetted. When A.O. Jian submitted an application to enter the Central Sea region, the emissary sent it to the Central Sea region along with all the information about A.O. Jian that the underworld had investigated. Where did he start? How did he establish his organization? How did he develop and rise? The underworld headquarters knew all of this information like the back of their hand. The vetting process could be said to be very strict. Therefore, even if the woman was at the peak of godly state, she still needed to be vetted. According to the information provided by the woman, the underworld headquarters immediately sent emissaries to collect information and conduct an investigation. At the same time, they collected information about the woman through various channels to ensure that there was no problem with the woman. The investigation lasted for half a year. When the emissary confirmed that the woman's identity was reliable and began to rush to the headquarters, an unexpected scene happened in the headquarters. For the past half a year, the woman had been staying in the underworld headquarters. All of her actions were closely monitored. If she made any strange movements, she might be killed by the internal experts. Fortunately, the woman seemed to be aware of this. She stayed in the underworld headquarters for most of her days and did not go out. However, the woman's body was deteriorating day by day. The member of the underworld headquarters who was responsible for monitoring the woman did not notice this at first. However, as the vitality of the island where the woman lived slowly faded and the plants withered, the member of the surveillance team immediately noticed that something was wrong and decisively reported the information to the headquarters. Soon, the investigation team in the headquarters received the information and came to investigate. The woman did not hide it anymore and chose to tell them about her body's condition. At that moment, the higher-ups of the underworld headquarters finally knew about the woman's condition. It turned out that the woman's body had already dried up and was no longer of any value. She hid in the Yellow Springs headquarters because she wanted to obtain the status of a member of the Yellow Springs Merchant Guild while she still had her strength. That way, even if he died, his future child would be nurtured by the Huang Quan headquarters and wouldn't have to wander outside and die at any moment. However, half a year had passed, and the messenger had yet to return. She could no longer hold on. Knowing this, the Underworld Merchant Guild's investigation team, in charge of investigating the woman's identity, immediately decided to expel the woman from the underworld headquarters. After all, the Yellow Springs headquarters still had their own rules. They would not keep any idlers around, except for A.O. Jian. To be more precise, he would not raise worthless idlers. The woman who was on the brink of death had been categorized as a worthless idler by the investigation team. It was perfectly normal for him to be driven out. At this time, the emissary who had gone out to investigate returned and conveyed the woman's information to the investigation team. However, this information was now completely worthless. After looking through it for a while, the investigation team decided to banish the woman from the Yellow Springs headquarters. Right at this moment, the woman took the initiative to make a request. Before he died, he would help the Underworld Merchant Guild do one thing while he still had strength, even if it meant throwing his life away. Her request was simple. She wanted her child to stay in the Yellow Springs headquarters and be nurtured. Regarding such a request, the investigation team neither agreed nor rejected it. Instead, they chose to ask their superior. Soon, their superior replied to the woman's request. They could agree to it. However, The condition was to be in the north of the Central Sea region, where divinity was about to be born as an offering to the underworld merchant guild in battle. This request was equivalent to sending the woman to her death and squeezing out her last bit of value. Regarding this request, the woman chose to agree to it without hesitation. However, before fulfilling this request, the woman hoped that her child's future could be guaranteed. He wanted to be apprenticed to someone in the Underworld Merchant Guild. Regarding this request, the higher-ups of the Underworld Merchant Guild chose to agree to it after some consideration. As for who to be apprenticed to, the higher-ups of the Underworld Merchant Guild would be very distressed. The 3 venerables, the 3 demon stars, the 6 earthly spirits, and so on. Although there were many powerhouses in the headquarters, it was not easy for these powerhouses to accept disciples. Either the disciple they accepted was similar to their own cultivation method, or the disciple was extremely talented. However, no matter how talented the disciple was, the lowest threshold was the Ghost Emperor realm. However, this woman's child was only an ordinary Ghost Soldier realm. He could not reach the threshold for these powerhouses to accept disciples at all. At this moment, someone thought of Ao Jian, who was only in the Divine Realm, but relied on his adopted children to climb up the ranks. Due to Ao Jian's current special status, the investigation team naturally did not dare to force Ao Jian to accept disciples. With the mentality of giving it a try, they found Ao Jian and made this request. When Ao Jian heard this news, he naturally wanted to reject it. After all, his plot had not developed to the end yet. There were still 2 most important thresholds. The first was to break through to the ancient god realm, and the second was to integrate all the water sword essences to forge the sword essence of the law. Therefore, Ao Jian had no intention of accepting disciples at all. Regarding this, the investigation team felt helpless, but they still chose to tell the woman the news. As a result, the next day, Ao Jian, who was in closed-door cultivation, met the woman who brought Sui Yi. She knelt down and begged him to accept the child. Ao Jian's heart did not waver because at this time, he did not want to train anyone except for cultivation. However, after seeing Sui Yi, Ao Jian inexplicably felt that he looked very familiar. That shiny bald head was too King eye-catching. Isn't this that? After thinking for a while, Ao Jian still could not remember the specific name. He only vaguely remembered that it seemed to be called Bald Mentor. This could be said to be fate, or it could also be said to be an inevitable event in the development of the plot. Faced with the woman who was begging, Ao Jian sighed in his heart. He turned his head to look at Sui Yi, who was pulling the corner of his mother's clothes, and said, "Are you willing to be my son?" Before the confused Sui Yi could agree, the woman spoke first. She repeatedly said yes, and then pressed Sui Yi to kneel on the ground, making him kowtow to Ao Jian to acknowledge him as his father. After confirming the relationship between Sui Yi and Ao Jian, the woman left. However, she did not take Sui Yi with her when she left, but left him by Ao Jian's side. Although she was reluctant when she left, she knew that it was time for her to fulfill her promise. We will never see each other again. May your future be like a dragon. May your future be immortal. May your future be peaceful and without regrets. That day, Sui Yi cried loudly. Although he was young, Sui Yi knew very well that his mother was seriously ill. What his mother said before she left was more like a farewell. He had already realized that he was about to lose his mother. He was so sad about it that he even wanted to follow his mother's footsteps. However, Ao Jian stopped him and told him something. Without strength, you're just a burden. Remember to hate, and take revenge when you're strong enough. That's what you should do. Ao Jian did not ask what Sui Yi had experienced, nor did he know the reason why his mother was seriously injured. He only told Sui Yi the importance of strength. With strength, one could do anything one wanted to do. One could use strength to save his mother, and one could use strength to take revenge. Strength was the foundation of everything. At that moment, the young Sui Yi had a vague concept of strength. After that, Sui Yi never saw his mother again. Ao Jian had also secretly asked someone to investigate this matter. where he learned that Sui Ye's mother was sacrificed as a sacrifice for the Acheron Chamber of Commerce. He chose to hide this matter and began to teach Sui Ye the sword. Sui Ye's talent in sword was extremely strong. There was an unyielding and free strength in his heart. His heart of the sword was more like a free sword. Compared to Ao Jian, Sui Ye's talent was much better. In a short period of time, he forged a heart of the sword that matched his attributes. In half a year, he broke through the Ghost Soldier realm and reached the Ghost Commander realm. During the contact, Ao Jian gradually developed feelings for Sui Yi, who was extremely talented in the cultivation of sword will. He even raised Sui Yi as his own child. Occasionally, he would give some resources to Sui Yi, allowing his strength to improve by leaps and bounds. However, Ao Jian also noticed all the flaws in Sui Ye's cultivation. That was, the hostility in his heart was still too strong. This would more or less affect the cultivation speed of his free sword will. After all, the disappearance of his mother had caused this child to suffer too much. Ao Jian could not change this. He could only hope that time could erase this memory. In the following cultivation, Ao Jian only had a little bald pendant by his side. Sui Yi also called Ao Jian father, like Ao Jian's adopted children. He regarded Ao Jian as his only family. In fact, Ao Jian would be lying if he said he was not envious of Sui Ye's cultivation progress. The time taken by Sui Yi to condense a sword was more than 10 times faster than Ao Jian. There were no bottlenecks in the early stage. In comparison, Ao Jian's cultivation speed could be described as the speed of a tortoise. This was not to say that Ao Jian's talent was extremely poor. The main reason was that the sword will that he cultivated did not match his attributes. There was even a state of conflicting attributes. Therefore, whenever Sui Yi asked to learn Ao Jian's sea sword will, Ao Jian would choose to refuse. This was because learning these sword wills with attributes would only limit Sui Ye's future development, which was disadvantageous to him. Ao Jian had already deeply understood this. Naturally, he did not want Sui Yi to experience the hardships and repeat the same mistakes. However, Sui Yi never gave up on this point. From time to time, he requested to learn the water sword will. From Sui Yi's point of view, the water sword will was Ao Jian's strongest unique skill. The other sword wills were only Ao Jian's side skills. They were not comparable to the main sword will. However, despite Sui Yi's repeated pleas, Ao Jian still did not choose to agree. Since you have become my son, then you should walk your own path and not copy my own path. It was the same for Ao Jian's other adopted sons. Although they were all taught by Ao Jian, they walked their own path and never copied his. Only Sui Yi, who had a strong desire for power, was an exception. Time passed in the process of cultivation and growth. The cultivation resources that Ao Jian received were increasing day by day. Gradually, there was the addition of divine spiritual materials. Divine spiritual materials were extremely precious spiritual materials even in the Central Sea area. Ordinary members of the Chamber of Commerce were not qualified to use them. However, Ao Jian was different. As the sword master, he would regularly receive a batch of divine spiritual materials to assist in his cultivation. At the same time, as the status of the adopted sons in the headquarters rose day by day, they were gradually qualified to receive divine spiritual materials. Apart from using these precious divine spiritual materials for their own cultivation, the adopted sons would often send some to Ao Jian when they visited him. Ao Jian could be said to be the most enviable existence in the Acheron Chamber of Commerce. Others had to fight desperately for divine spiritual materials. They put in a lot of effort and even lost their lives in the battle. Only Ao Jian was different. His current mission was to break through to the ancient god realm. In terms of divine spiritual materials, he had the support of both the headquarters and the adopted sons. This was a treatment that everyone longed for. However, Ao Jian's heart was not calm. Although he did not fight for these divine spiritual materials, the adopted sons were in the most competitive areas in the Central Sea area. They often encountered life and death crises. It could be said that these divine spiritual materials were stained with the blood of the adopted sons. It was not easy to obtain them. At this moment, Ao was no longer as relaxed as he was when he adopted the adopted sons. Instead, he felt a heavy sense of guilt. At this moment, he only hoped to complete the plot challenge as soon as possible and leave this place. The days of cultivation were boring. Fortunately, he had Sui Yi to accompany him this time. Just like that, countless thoughts passed by. On this day, Ao felt the arrival of a bottleneck. Long prepared, Ao took out all the divine spiritual materials he had accumulated and began to work hard to break through to the ancient god realm. The news that Ao was about to break through shocked the entire Acheron Chamber of Commerce. The ancient god realm was different from the god realm. It was the core combat power in the Central Sea area. The number of ancient god realm experts was the key factor to determine the strength of a force. Therefore, on the day of Ao breakthrough, many senior members of the Acheron Chamber of Commerce came to support Ao. The heavenly sword formation was activated. Thousands of sword rays pierced through the clouds and sprinkled specks of starlight. As the formation operated, the divine spiritual materials inside were crushed and turned into a thick spiritual mist. The mist floated in the formation and wrapped around Ao. It took him half a year to break through to the next realm. During this half a year, the senior members of the Acheron Chamber of Commerce did not leave the headquarters. They kept staring at the formation and looked forward to the birth of another expert in the headquarters. Ao did not disappoint them. Although his cultivation speed was very slow and he spent more cultivation resources than others, his foundation was very solid. In the end, he broke through the extremely difficult threshold and stepped into the ancient god realm. At that moment, the chanting of the sea sounded in the Central Sea area. The shadow of the Acheron sea god descended and gave Ao blessings for his advancement to the ancient god realm. His name also flashed with colorful light on the underworld god list and moved up. That day, Ao spent the day in the congratulations of the members of the Acheron Chamber of Commerce. However, the next day, Ao set foot on the road to the 6 paths of reincarnation. Although he had reached the ancient god realm, he did not have the powerful sword will that matched the ancient god realm, which was the sword will of the law. The place near the 6 paths of reincarnation was also the area with the densest law aura. He wanted to condense his strongest sword will of the law there. After bidding farewell to his adopted children, Ao set foot on the end of his plot. Beside the 6 paths of reincarnation, the praying soul flower bloomed. The air was filled with an intoxicating scent that made one's soul tremble and could not help but want to fall asleep. The further in he went, the more it was so. In such an environment, Ao forgot about the time and devoted himself to cultivation. All the sword will of the water was crushed and recombined during the cultivation. Little by little, it merged with the sword will law in the heart of the sword and combined into his strongest sword will of the law. The moment the sword was formed, a stronger power of law floated out of the 6 paths of reincarnation and wrapped around Ao. At that moment, Ao comprehended the Acheron sword venerable's strongest sword, the sea god sword. At that moment, the illusion became blurred. The final battle that he imagined did not happen. Ao originally thought that the illusion of the battle between sword wills was a battle between sword wills. The end of the plot would be the final battle between him and the Acheron sword venerable to determine who was the stronger one. However, the fact was that when he comprehended the Acheron sword venerable's strongest sword, he had already obtained the approval of the sea god sword will. The illusion became blurred at that moment. Everything was like the moon in the mirror. The moment it touched, it was about to turn into ripples and disperse. At that moment, Ao figure flickered constantly. He controlled the sea god sword will to bring him back to the Acheron headquarters in a flash. He wanted to see his adopted children one more time before he left. The scene around him became blurred. It was too late. His adopted children who were out on expeditions were not at the headquarters. When Ao Jian returned, he could only see Sui Yi, who had broken through the demigod realm. At that moment, Sui Yi's face was no longer childish. There was a sharpness in his eyes. It was familiar yet strange. Before leaving, Ao Jian took a deep look at Sui Yi, who was full of surprise. He sighed in his heart. Everything around him turned into nothingness at that moment. The illusion ended. At that moment, Ao Jian woke up from the illusion. At that moment, a teasing voice came from his side. "You've come back to your senses? You're going to die again." In Sui Yi's opinion, Ao Jian, who had come back to his senses, would be killed by the sea god Sword Will. Upon hearing that, Ao Jian immediately turned to look at Sui Yi. The memory in his mind slowly faded at that moment, but it had not completely disappeared. Looking at Sui Yi's familiar face and his annoying expression, Ao Jian subconsciously frowned and put on a stern face. "How can you talk to your father like that? I'll punish you to kneel in the sword mound for 30 days. Sui Yi. Upon hearing that, Sui Yi was dumbfounded. "What did you just call me?" Sui Yi widened his eyes and raised the giant's sword in his hand. Although he was extremely angry, Sui Yi did not know why, but he suddenly felt that Ao Jian was very similar to the Acheron sword venerable. This was because when the sword venerable was angry, he would often adopt this posture, and the punishment was to kneel in the sword mound. This made Sui Yi feel as if he had seen a ghost. However, he could not lose in terms of momentum. At that moment, Ao Jian's memory in the illusion had become extremely blurred and disappeared completely in the blink of an eye. At that moment, Ao Jian was also dumbfounded. Since he did not have the memory of the illusion, Ao Jian did not know why he would say such arrogant words. How dare he call himself father to Sui Yi, the peerless swordsman, who gave him the courage? However, no matter how hard Ao Jian tried to recall, he could not think of the reason why he would say such words. Although it was indeed very smooth, as if he had always called it that way. Looking at Sui Yi, Ao Jian felt very sad. He could only say awkwardly, "It said that the memory of a fish only lasts for 7 seconds. I suspect that I'm in this state now, believe it or not." Chapter 703. Actually, if you're willing, I can teach you my understanding of the rule of sword essence. He grew up tenaciously and eventually used the sword essence in his heart to boil all the sufferings into sweet honey. Ao Jian didn't know about this part of history, but the players who frequented the forum were very clear about it. Then, he quickly opened a friend list, clicked on Mo Lamlin's profile picture, and sent message. He knew how tempting the rule of sword essence was to Sui Yi. It could be said that any swordsman could not refuse such a free opportunity. The rule of sword essence instantly disintegrated Sui Yi's sword essence. Logically speaking, he should be very unfamiliar with this strange power, and it would take him a long time to be able to use it. However, the fact was that he had already mastered this sword essence. Thinking of this, Sui Yi suddenly felt very sad. This sense of familiarity and intimacy made Ao Jian feel strange, but it felt very real. Will we die on the way? Did I really succeed in the challenge? At this moment, not far from Ao Jian, Mo Xiaoxin, who was in a state of negative body, was quietly watching Ao Jian and Sui Yi. Therefore, Ao Jian still made his move. He immediately pressed his hand on Sui Yi's shoulder, and the rule of sword essence immediately surged into Sui Yi's body. It began to calm Sui Yi's trembling sword heart so that it would not break. Not to mention surpassing, just being on par with it was not something that ordinary people could do. At this moment, the white light that was condensed by the sword essence shattered inch by inch until it completely turned into light spots. Although every main plot of Ao Jian in the illusion was the same as Swordmaster Amu, the two of them took a completely different path in every choice and branch plot development. The imagined plot of Neptune's sword essence killing Ao Jian did not happen. Instead, the golden figure transformed by Neptune's sword essence collapsed, revealing its azure blue body. With the surging of the power of the rule, Ao Jian's sword heart world gradually expanded and perfected. In a blur, two figures, one big and one small, appeared in front of him. This was because Ao Jian's sword essence was not worth mentioning at all. It could not even be compared to himself, let alone the rule of sword essence imprinted with the general outline of Sword Master Underworld. Obviously, Ao Jian did not defeat Neptune's sword essence in the sword essence competition, but Neptune's sword essence took the initiative to give the power of the rule of sword essence to Ao Jian. He was not reconciled to this, and it questioned the sword venerable loudly. At this moment, Poseidon's sword will suddenly shattered, and the most original power of the rule of sword began to invade Ao Jian's body. At the same time, the consciousness of the underworld swordsman and the accompanying sword were completely shattered. At this moment, Sui was still looking at Ao Jian with resentment, even though Ao Jian had helped him this time. This was an opportunity for Ao Jian. He had obtained the incomparably precious power of law. Although it was not the origin of law, it was still a supreme divine item that countless creatures in the underworld had been searching for. This was a glorious path of growth. The two of them finally stepped into the Central Sea region of the Yellow Springs. Under Sui Ye's incredulous gaze, the rule of sword intent slowly approached Ao Jian and began to dance around him. They set off from the sand-filled sealed area and walked step by step towards the future, pursuing that smear of blue. Amu also had the sea sword intent, but he felt that his sea sword heart was not worse than anyone else's. Because he yearned for the sea, his heart had a rock-solid sea sword heart. Moreover, Sui knew that even if he did not make a move, the swordsman in front of him would still die. The subsequent path of growth was even more different. They were both cultivating, but Amu longed for power and becoming stronger more than Ao Jian. Even though he was an unfamiliar successor, he only left behind a wisp of the purest rule of sword intent, erasing all traces that he had imprinted on the rule of sword intent, which was the Poseidon sword will. No, we have already gotten rid of the seal, and we will find a new home. For some reason, Sui always gave him a sense of familiarity. If it was not for the rule of sword intent, he would not have been able to hold back the big sword in his hand and would have cut Ao Jian into pieces. They walked together, struggling to survive in the sand-filled world. They slowly walked towards the blue world in the distance and continued to move forward in the emerald world that was full of danger. Seeing this scene, Ao Jian's face turned solemn. I'm willing. According to the normal development, the next step would be the rule of sword intent killing Ao Jian. Without the characteristic of immortality, how many people could surpass Sword Master Amu on the same path? At that time, the majority of the players in the forum supported that the Underworld Sword Master was stronger than the venerable demonic ape because they listened to the live broadcast of the Underworld Sword Master's difficult and unyielding growth history. Ao Jian's realm did not improve because of this opportunity, but under the power of the rule of sword intent, all sword intents were subservient to him. Sui's heart was filled with confusion. He suffered a blow to his heart, and his eyes gradually turned red. His sword heart was in disorder, and at this moment he was also wavering. When he heard Ao Jian say to Sui Yi that he was his long-lost son, Emo Xiaoxin was shocked. My dear mother, this is bad. Guess what shocking secret I found out? That scumbag Ao Jian. He hid it from you and had the surrounding mist of sword intent also gradually faded at this moment. As Ao Jian obtained the final rule of sword intent, the killing feast of sword intent competition ended prematurely. What he desired the most was to possess the strength of the sword master, and then find out the cause of his mother's death. This was because he knew that in order to achieve any goal, the foundation was to have sufficient strength. What's there? Taking a deep breath, Sui tried to calm himself down. During this journey, Amu was not as lonely as Ao Jian. Ashu, who was by his side, had more potential than him. His pair of iron fists suppressed the strong enemies in the sea, and his high vitality allowed him to resurrect on the spot, even if he was cut into pieces. Why? At this moment, Sui Ye's face revealed an indescribable excitement, but deep in his heart, he felt that it was a little unreal. Thinking of this, Sui immediately said, however, the fact was that although the sword master treated him like his own son, he never taught him the essence of his sword intent. Instead, he let him walk a path that belonged to him. Affected by his emotions, his free sword intent was completely inconsistent with his current state of mind and was on the verge of breaking. As the field of swordsmanship dissipated, the sea returned to its original state. At this moment, Ao Jian was also dumbfounded. As his memory in the dreamland was completely obscured, he had no idea why he was recognized by the sea god's sword intent. The look in his eyes was like a senior looking at a junior, and it even reminded Sui Yi of the underworld swordmaster who had fallen. This was also taught to him by the swordmaster. This time, he thought that the plot would remain the same and there would be no changes, but he did not expect the sword intent to recognize Ao Jian. He did not expect Ao Jian to say this because Ao Jian had no reason to help him. It's not a big problem. If you want to learn, I can teach you, but you have to pay a price. However, what he did not expect was that Ao Jian nodded readily and said, Amu, before you leave, you have to promise me that you must persist until the end and never give up. He slowly raised his hand to meet the white light and touched it. The starting point of this scene was a sealed place. As time passed, the seal was destroyed, and the two people who were sleeping woke up. At this moment, Ao Jian did not panic. Moreover, what made Sui very uncomfortable was the way Ao Jian looked at him. This time, when the sword master fell, he thought that he was the most legitimate successor of the sword intent. He did not expect that all of this still did not belong to him, but to be obtained by an outsider. This was not a sad story, but an inspiring history of growth. However, for some reason, Ao Jian's heart resonated with it. Hearing this, Ao Jian had a strange look on his face. Instead, he chose the sword intent challenge. Although he was defeated by the Devil Ape Lord, this did not negate the strength of the underworld swordmaster. He originally thought that Ao Jian wanted to give him the law of sword intent, but he did not expect that Ao Jian wanted him to comprehend it on his own. Moreover, he was sure that he did not win the battle of sword intent because the Poseidon sword intent was still dazzling, and there was no sign of defeat. Thinking of this, Sui sneered. Looking at Ao Jian, who was confident of winning, Sui wailed in his heart. What Ao Jian obtained was the underworld sword venerable's fusion of all the sword wills and a wisp of sword wills from the 6 paths of reincarnation, which belonged to the source of sword wills. After struggling for a while, Sui chose to agree to Ao Jian's request. This time, he decided to learn the law of sword intent from Ao Jian. The law of sword intent that he mastered also made him rarely have a match in the same realm. As an ancient god, the underworld sword master was once one of the people at the top of the pyramid in the underworld. In fact, Sui did not have much hope when he asked this question. After all, this ability was definitely Ao Jian's biggest trump card. How could he teach it to an outsider? This was a journey that was completely different from Ao Jian's. At the moment when Ao Jian entered the illusion, they were not far from the sea. They did not have to travel for as long as 3 years. Are you willing? Ao Jian smiled and continued to speak. I promise you, Ashu, these images faded in the end. As the consciousness left by the underworld sword master shattered, the memory hidden in the depths of the consciousness completely dissipated and the images ended. This was because he did not feel any threat. At this moment, he was stunned. During this period, Ao Jian vaguely heard a conversation. At this moment, Ao Jian also came back to his senses. I have been the disciple of the underworld sword master all my life, and now I have to be the disciple of his successor? The thin figure held the other person's hand and looked up to ask. Ao Jian immediately turned his head and saw a flash of white light with a majestic sword intent slashing toward his head. In fact, as long as Ao Jian had watched the video released by reading more than 1,000 scrolls in the forum that explained the story of the underworld swordmaster, he would know some of the life stories of the underworld swordmaster. They had only known each other for a short period of time, but it felt like they had known each other for a long time. Looking at Sui Ye's furious eyes, Ao Jian knew what he was thinking and could not help but sigh. The truth was just as he thought. Every time Ao Jian challenged, he could not hold on for more than a few minutes. The result was that he was killed by the sword intent without exception. Just like how the underworld sword master did not let Sui Yi inherit his sword intent, he did not want others to continue on his path. Is that true? This power gave Ao Jian an illusion that he was the master of the sword and the master of thousands of sword intents. Hearing this, Sui Yi was stunned. I'm only passing on my understanding of a law of sword intent. As for whether you can condense your own law of sword intent, it's still up to you. See, God's sword intent's action of getting close to Ao Jian completely shocked Sui Yi. Although his memory was covered, the understanding of sword intent remained in his mind. One of them had boundless life force surging in his body, while the other had a blue sword intent in his body. His story was more like a spirit. Looking at Ao Jian's awkward face, Sui Yi felt like killing someone. However, his smile soon froze. He felt that he would regret it for the rest of his life if he missed this opportunity. At the end of the story, the two who had accompanied each other from the beginning had reached the peak and arrived at the center of the Azure Sea. From then on, that place was their home. Relying on Ao Jian's sword intent, Sui Yi's sword heart finally stabilized. This was because Ao Jian had taken away what he wanted the most. This hatred could not be erased with one helping. It was a deep hatred. In fact, the illusory challenge was the most difficult stage in the sword intent field. Apart from the law of sword intent, are you willing to teach me the supernatural power of resurrection? Are you really willing to teach me the law of sword intent that you have comprehended? It was also because of this battle that Mu was valued by the current underworld sword master and joined the underworld chamber of commerce. Thinking of this, Ao Jian's face was filled with shock and disbelief. You might not believe it, but I feel like you're my long-lost son. Of course. A large number of players began to move toward the central area where the sword intent field was originally, wanting to see what was there. Just like a sword that had been sharpened, it would finally shine and shine at the moment the sword was formed. Even though Ao Jian did not rely on his own strength to obtain the inheritance, he relied on the advantage of repeated memories to reach Mu's level, but he did not surpass it. Mu was not like Ao Jian, who chose to become the disciple of the Central Sea area. Although he did not collect all the sword intents, Ao Jian still completed the challenge with his immortality, which was equivalent to taking a shortcut to obtain the inheritance. At the same time, there was another person who shone during this journey. With the change of his state of mind, Sui Yi's sword heart cracked and was about to break. Hearing this, Ao Jian knew that things had taken a turn for the better, and a smile appeared on his face. Therefore, although Sui Yi's sword was strong, it was not worth mentioning in front of Ao Jian, who had mastered the law of sword. More importantly, he really wanted to know how Ao Jian managed to be reborn after death. Although Ao Jian had said something like, "If you want to learn, I can teach you," in Sui Yi's eyes, it was just a joke. Impossible, go to hell. At this moment, an unwilling roar interrupted Ao Jian's thoughts. There's an endless water source. You'll never be thirsty again. However, the answer he received never changed. Looking at the broken sword intent, Sui Yi's face was filled with disbelief. At this moment, Ao Jian had obtained the most original power of the law, instead of the Neptune sword intent of Underworld Swordmaster. Water that can't be finished. That place is great. Therefore, he was not afraid of any sword intent. How is this possible? How did you do it? Sui Yi could not help but exclaim. They walked hand in hand, hungry and cold, but never gave up. The yearning for the sea was the driving force that kept them going. Such a sword intent competition was undoubtedly like mayflies trying to shake a tree, overestimating themselves. Could it be that after inheriting the inheritance, even his personality was affected? Even if he did not want to admit it, the reality was that Ao Jian had obtained the inheritance left by the Underworld Swordmaster and the sword intent of the law. Sui Yi was speechless. After all, he had tasted the consequences of being impulsive here several times. He He did not want to lose the hard-earned sword intent again. Therefore, all of this was unrealistic to Sui Yi. He dare not believe that it was true. The moment he opened his eyes, a majestic sword intent rose from the bottom of his heart. Hearing this, Sui Yi's face immediately fell. It made Ao Jian feel as if he was one of them. It was very familiar, but also very vague. This journey lasted for 3 years. Why did you do this to me? At this moment, Sui Yi's sword heart was trembling. He was greatly agitated and obviously could not accept this. Bang! After his mother's death, he had been following the underworld sword master as a sword disciple to pursue his sword principles.